On November 16th, 2023, at exactly 2:47 p.m., a single PDF file uploaded to a Manhattan federal court's electronic system would trigger the most spectacular collapse in entertainment history, transforming Sean Diddy Combs from hip-hop's reigning billionaire into federal inmate number 37452-054 in just 573 days. The document, a 35-page federal lawsuit filed by his ex-girlfriend Cassie Ventura, contained allegations so shocking that within minutes of its filing, entertainment industry executives were frantically calling emergency meetings. By sunset that same day, three major brands had already begun internal discussions about severing ties with the man who had redefined what it meant to be a mogul. Within 24 hours, Combs would pay $20 million to make the lawsuit disappear, a decision that would prove to be the most expensive mistake of his life. But to understand how one lawsuit could obliterate a billion-dollar empire built over 3 decades, we must first travel back to November 4th, 1969, when a future emperor was born in the concrete jungle of Harlem, completely unaware that his father had been marked for death. The making of a mogul, from tragedy to triumph. Sean John Combs entered the world during one of Harlem's most turbulent periods, when the neighborhood was simultaneously a cultural renaissance hub and a battleground for the drug trade that would claim his father's life. Melvin Earl Combs, just 33 years old, was gunned down in his car on January 26, 1972, when Sean was barely 2 years old. The official story was that Melvin was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a case of mistaken identity and a drug deal gone wrong. The truth, which wouldn't surface until decades later, was far more sinister. Court documents sealed for over 30 years revealed that Melvin had been skimming money from Lucas's organization, and his murder was a calculated execution designed to send a message to other potential thieves. This revelation would haunt Sean throughout his life, creating a complex relationship with power, money, and violence that would eventually manifest in ways that would destroy everything he built. But in 1972, 3-year-old Sean only knew that his father was gone, and his mother Janice was left to raise him alone in Mount Vernon, New York. Janice Combs was a woman of remarkable resilience, working multiple jobs to ensure her son never felt the absence of his father's financial support. She worked as a model, a teacher's assistant, and eventually landed a stable job at a local school district. But more importantly, she instilled in Sean a hunger for success that bordered on obsession. "You have to be 10 times better than everyone else," she would tell him, a mantra that would drive him to extraordinary heights and eventually contribute to his downfall. The young Sean Combs displayed entrepreneurial instincts from an early age that were both impressive and concerning. At age 12, he was already running a paper route with military precision, not just delivering papers, but analyzing which customers tipped best and adjusting his service accordingly. By 14, he was organizing neighborhood parties and charging admission, demonstrating an early understanding of how to monetize social gatherings, a skill that would later evolve into something far more sinister. His classmates at Mount St. Michael Academy, a Catholic preparatory school in the Bronx, remember him as charismatic but ruthless. He was the kind of student who would charm teachers while simultaneously running an underground economy of test answers and homework completion services. His yearbook quote, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman," wouldn't be written by Jay-Z for another 2 decades, but the sentiment was already embedded in Sean's DNA. The transformation began at Howard University, where Sean enrolled in 1987 as a business major. Howard, historically known as the Black Harvard, was where Sean first encountered the kind of wealth and influence he desperately wanted to possess. He saw classmates whose parents were senators, judges, and Fortune 500 executives, and he realized that his mother's middle-class stability, while admirable, would never give him access to the corridors of real power. But it was also at Howard where Sean first displayed the controlling behavior that would later become his signature and his curse. His girlfriend at the time, who requested anonymity for this account, described a young man who was charming in public but possessive and demanding in private. "He had to know where I was every minute," she recalled. "He would show up at my dorm unannounced, go through my belongings, and interrogate me about male friends." The pattern would only intensify when Sean made the decision that would change his life forever: dropping out of Howard University after his sophomore year to pursue an unpaid internship at Uptown Records in New York City. It was 1990 and hip-hop was transitioning from underground movement to mainstream phenomenon. Sean sensed that whoever controlled this transition would control the future of popular culture. But what he couldn't have known was that his internship would place him directly in the path of Andre Harrell, a man whose mentorship would teach Sean not just about the music business, but about the intoxicating nature of absolute power and how easily that power could corrupt. The Uptown education learning the game. Andre Harrell, the founder and CEO of Uptown Records, was everything Sean Combs aspired to become. At 30 years old, Harrell was already a millionaire, driving a Bentley, wearing custom suits, and wielding the kind of influence that could make or break careers with a single phone call. He was also, according to multiple sources who worked at Uptown during this period, a man whose success had given him a sense of invincibility that would prove prophetic for Sean's future. The Uptown Records offices in Midtown Manhattan were unlike anything Sean had ever experienced. This wasn't just a record label, it was a temple to excess, where million-dollar deals were negotiated over bottles of Cristal champagne, and where the line between business and pleasure had been obliterated entirely. The company had discovered and developed some of the biggest names in R&B and hip-hop, including Heavy D, Guy, and Godesi, giving it credibility that newer labels desperately envied. Sean's first day as an intern was September 15, 1990, and within hours he had made an impression that would define his trajectory. While other interns were content to answer phones and file paperwork, Sean was studying the power dynamics of every interaction, learning who really made decisions and how those decisions were influenced. He noticed that Andre Harrell's assistant wielded more practical power than some vice presidents, and he began cultivating her as an ally. But it was his response to a crisis that truly caught Harrell's attention. In November 1990, just 2 months into his internship, Uptown was planning a major promotional event for Jodeci at a club in Queens. The event was crucial for the group's career momentum, but 3 days before the party, the venue canceled due to a payment dispute with the event promoter. While executives panicked about the potential damage to Jodeci's reputation, Sean quietly worked the phones, leveraging relationships he had built during his brief time at Howard and his years organizing neighborhood parties. Within 24 hours, he had secured not just a replacement venue, but a better one, the legendary Latin Quarter, a venue that had helped launch the careers of numerous hip-hop artists. The event was a massive success with over 100 to 200 attendees and coverage in multiple music publications. But more importantly, it demonstrated Sean's ability to solve problems through a combination of charm, persistence, and what some observers described as a willingness to promise anything to anyone if it served his immediate needs. Andre Harrell was impressed, but he was also concerned. Sean had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the world when he needed something from you, recalled a former Uptown executive who witnessed Sean's early career. But the moment he got what he wanted, you became invisible. Within 6 months, Sean had been promoted from intern to assistant, and within a year he was Andre Harrell's right-hand man, with the title of Director of A&R. It was an unprecedented rise that generated both admiration and resentment within the company. Some employees viewed him as a prodigy whose success was well-deserved. Others saw him as a skilled manipulator who had gamed the system. The truth, as would become clear over the following decades, was probably both. Sean's approach to artist development at Uptown was revolutionary in its attention to image and marketing, but it also revealed early signs of the controlling behavior that would later manifest in more dangerous ways. He didn't just sign artists, he attempted to control every aspect of their lives, from their appearance to their personal relationships. His work with Jodeci exemplified this approach. The group, consisting of 4 young men from North Carolina, had raw talent but lacked the polish necessary for mainstream success. Sean redesigned their image, transforming them from small-town R&B singers into leather-clad bad boys who projected both sexuality and danger. The transformation was brilliant from a marketing perspective, but it came at a cost that wouldn't be fully understood until years later. Sean controlled not just their professional image, but their personal lives, dictating who they could date, where they could go, and how they should behave in public. He made us feel like we owed him everything, Haley recalled. The success of Jodeci's debut album, Forever My Lady, which went triple platinum and spawned multiple hit singles, cemented Sean's reputation as a marketing genius. But it also reinforced his belief that success justified any means necessary to achieve it, a philosophy that would guide his decisions for the next 3 decades. His work with Mary J. Blige further demonstrated both his brilliance and his troubling tendencies. Sean didn't just produce Mary's debut album, he essentially created the template for what would become known as hip-hop soul, a fusion of R&B vocals with hip-hop beats and attitude. Was a commercial and critical success that established Mary J. But those close to the project later described Sean's behavior during the recording process as obsessive and controlling. He would arrive at the studio at all hours, demanding changes to songs that had already been completed. He monitored Mary's personal life, expressing disapproval of her relationships and social activities. It was weird, recalled a sound engineer who worked on the album. Sean would talk about protecting Mary and the other artists, but it felt more like he was trying to own them. The pattern was becoming clear, but in the context of the music industry's notoriously exploitative practices, Sean's behavior seemed like standard artist management rather than something more sinister. Record labels had always exerted significant control over their artists' lives, and Sean's success with Jodeci and Mary J. Blige suggested that his methods, however intense, were effective. But Andre Harrell was beginning to have concerns. Sean's success had made him increasingly confident, and that confidence was manifesting in ways that made Harrell uncomfortable. Sean had begun making decisions without consulting Harrell, signing artists and committing company resources based on his own judgment. More troubling, he was developing a reputation for explosive anger when his authority was challenged. The breaking point came in July 1993 during a meeting about Uptown's future direction. Sean had been pushing for the label to focus more heavily on hip-hop, arguing that R&B was becoming commercially obsolete. He accused Harrell of being out of touch, threatened to quit, and according to one account, swept papers off Harrell's desk in a display of rage. Andre Harrell fired Sean Combs that same day, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I created a monster," Harrell would later admit to friends. But Sean's firing from Uptown, devastating as it was at the time, would prove to be the catalyst for his transformation from talented employee to industry titan. Within weeks of his termination, he was already planning his next move, and that move would change not just his own life, but the entire trajectory of hip-hop culture. The empire he was about to build would dwarf everything he had accomplished at Uptown, but it would also magnify every troubling tendency he had displayed during his time there, creating a power structure that would enable behavior that would eventually bring down everything he had worked to create. The birth of Bad Boy. Building an empire on ambition and obsession. On July 23, 1993, just 2 weeks after his termination from Uptown Records, Sean Combs walked into the offices of Arista Records, carrying a business plan that would reshape popular music forever. The document, meticulously prepared and bound in leather, outlined his vision for Bad Boy Entertainment, a multimedia empire that would combine music production, artist management, and lifestyle branding in ways that had never been attempted before. But what the business plan didn't reveal was the darkness that would lurk beneath Bad Boy's glossy exterior, or the fact that Sean's vision of control would extend far beyond normal business practices into territory that would eventually be defined as criminal. Clive Davis, the legendary music executive who had built Arista Records into a powerhouse, was initially skeptical of Sean's proposal. At 61 years old, Davis had seen countless young executives promise to revolutionize the music industry, and most had failed spectacularly. But there was something about Sean's presentation that intrigued him, a combination of sophisticated market analysis and raw hunger that suggested this young man might actually be capable of delivering on his ambitious promises. The financial arrangement they negotiated was unprecedented in its scope. Arista would provide Bad Boy with $15 million in startup capital, plus distribution and marketing support. In exchange, Sean would retain creative control over his artists while giving Arista a significant percentage of profits. It was a deal that would make Sean wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, But it would also create the financial pressures that would drive him to increasingly desperate measures to maintain his lifestyle. Sean's first priority was finding a flagship artist who could establish Bad Boy's credibility in the competitive hip-hop marketplace. He had several candidates in mind, but none excited him as much as a young rapper from Brooklyn named Christopher Wallace, who performed under the stage name Biggie Smalls. The first time Sean heard Biggie's demo tape, he knew he had found something special. The young rapper's storytelling ability was extraordinary, painting vivid pictures of street life with a combination of humor, pathos, and raw authenticity that was unlike anything in the hip-hop landscape. But more importantly, Sean sensed that Biggie possessed the kind of charisma and larger-than-life personality that could transcend music and become a cultural icon. Their first meeting in August 1993 would be remembered by both men as a moment of instant connection. Biggie, who was struggling to support his girlfriend and infant daughter, was impressed by Sean's vision and financial backing. Sean, meanwhile, was fascinated by Biggie's street credibility and natural magnetism. It was like finding the perfect business partner, Sean would later recall. But even in those early days, there were signs of the controlling behavior that would later become Sean's trademark. He insisted on being involved in every aspect of Biggie's life, from his music to his personal relationships. He moved Biggie from Brooklyn to a luxury apartment in Manhattan, ostensibly to provide him with a better environment for creating music, but also to ensure that he remained under Sean's constant supervision. The recording process for Biggie's debut album, Ready to Die, revealed both Sean's genius as a producer and his troubling need for control. He would arrive at the studio each day with detailed notes about every aspect of the previous night's work, from the tempo of individual tracks to the inflection of specific words in Biggie's lyrics. He hired multiple engineers to work around the clock, ensuring that he could monitor every moment of the recording process. More concerning were the reports from studio personnel about Sean's behavior during recording sessions. He would often lock the studio doors, claiming it was necessary to maintain security and focus. He controlled who could enter the studio, creating a list of approved visitors that he would modify based on his mood and perceived threats to his authority. The album's eventual success vindicated Sean's intensive approach. G as one of hip-hop's most compelling voices. The album went platinum within months and spawned multiple hit singles, including Juicy and Big Papa, which became cultural touchstones that defined mid-1990s hip-hop. But the success also fed Sean's growing sense of invincibility. He began referring to himself as the man who made Biggie, and his behavior toward other artists and employees became increasingly imperious. Former Bad Boy employees from this period describe a workplace culture that was simultaneously exciting and toxic, where creativity flourished but personal boundaries were routinely violated. The signing of other artists to Bad Boy's roster followed a similar pattern. Sean would identify talented individuals who were struggling financially or professionally, offer them opportunities they couldn't refuse, and then gradually assert control over every aspect of their lives. The results were often commercially successful, but the human cost was becoming increasingly apparent to those who witnessed it firsthand. Sean controlled not just her music but her personal life, expressing disapproval of her relationships and social activities. Sean initially opposed the relationship, not because he had concerns about Faith's welfare, but because he worried that romance would distract Biggie from his music. The couple's eventual marriage in August 1994 was orchestrated by Sean as a publicity event, complete with photographers and entertainment journalists. But those close to the couple later revealed that Sean had pressured them to marry quickly, arguing that their relationship would generate valuable media attention for Bad Boy. The marriage would prove to be troubled, plagued by infidelity and conflict that some observers attributed to the pressures of living under Sean's constant scrutiny. Total, the R&B group that became another cornerstone of Bad Boy's success, experienced similar treatment. The group's members were young women from New Jersey who had been struggling to break into the music industry when Sean discovered them. He transformed them into a commercially successful act, but the process involved controlling every aspect of their image and presentation. He would dictate their wardrobe choices, monitor their personal relationships, and require them to seek his approval before making any public appearances. He made us feel like we owed him everything, Rayner recalled. The financial success of Bad Boy's early releases created a self-reinforcing cycle of success and control. Each platinum album generated millions of dollars in revenue, which Sean used to sign more artists, build more elaborate recording facilities, and expand his influence within the music industry. But the money also funded a lifestyle that was becoming increasingly divorced from normal social constraints. Sean's personal life during this period was characterized by excess and control that mirrored his professional behavior. He purchased multiple homes, including a mansion in East Hampton and a penthouse in Manhattan, each equipped with recording studios and surveillance systems. He began throwing parties that were legendary for their scale and exclusivity, events that served multiple purposes. They generated publicity for Bad Boy, provided networking opportunities with industry executives, and allowed Sean to demonstrate his power and influence. But the parties also became laboratories for the controlling behavior that would later evolve into criminal activity. Guests described events where Sean would monitor their activities, control their access to different areas of his properties, and sometimes record their conversations without consent. What seemed like eccentric behavior from a successful music executive was actually the development of techniques that would later be used for far more sinister purposes. The most troubling aspect of Sean's behavior during this period was his relationship with women. Multiple sources from the mid-1990s describe a pattern of behavior that involved using his power and influence to control and manipulate the women in his orbit. He would offer career opportunities to aspiring models, singers, and actresses, then gradually assert control over their personal lives. Sean was charming and generous, showering her with gifts and opportunities. But he also demanded to know her whereabouts at all times, monitored her phone calls, and expressed explosive anger when she attempted to maintain independence. The relationship with Kim Porter would continue on and off for over a decade, producing 3 children and serving as a template for Sean's future romantic relationships. The pattern was always the same: initial charm and generosity, followed by increasing demands for control and isolation from friends and family. But in 1994, Sean's controlling behavior was largely hidden from public view. The success of Bad Boy Records had made him one of the most powerful figures in hip-hop, and his personal life was shielded by a combination of wealth, influence, and the music industry's traditional tolerance for eccentric behavior among successful executives. The transformation of Sean Combs from talented music executive to cultural icon accelerated with the release of additional Bad Boy projects. Each success reinforced his belief that his methods, however extreme, were justified by their results. And each success also provided him with more resources and influence to pursue his vision of control. What nobody understood at the time was that Sean's vision of control was evolving into something far more dangerous than aggressive artist management. The techniques he was developing to manage his artists and control his business empire were laying the groundwork for a system of abuse that would eventually ensnare dozens of victims and culminate in federal criminal charges. The empire he was building would reach extraordinary heights, generating billions of dollars in revenue and making him one of the most influential figures in American popular culture, but it would also become a vehicle for systematic abuse, exploitation, and criminal behavior that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. G would transform him from behind-the-scenes executive to front and center celebrity. But that transformation would also remove the last constraints on his behavior, creating the conditions that would eventually lead to his downfall. The tragedy that made a star. From behind the scenes to center stage. At 12:30 a.m. on March 9, 1997, Sean Combs received the phone call that would change his life forever. G had been shot multiple times while leaving a party in Los Angeles, and he was being rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. By the time Sean arrived at the hospital, his greatest discovery and closest friend was dead, the victim of a drive-by shooting that remains officially unsolved to this day. But what the public didn't know was that Sean's reaction to Biggie's death would reveal the true nature of his character in ways that would prove prophetic for his future crimes. Even in his grief, Sean's first instinct was to control the narrative, manage the media response, and find ways to profit from the tragedy. The circumstances surrounding Biggie's death were complex and troubling. The shooting occurred during a period of intense rivalry between East Coast and West Coast hip-hop artists, a conflict that had been fueled by media attention and personal animosity between key figures in both camps. Sean had been instrumental in promoting this rivalry, recognizing that conflict generated publicity and record sales. In the months leading up to Biggie's death, Sean had made decisions that many observers believed unnecessarily escalated tensions between Bad Boy and Death Row Records, the Los Angeles-based label that represented Tupac Shakur and other West Coast artists. Sean had encouraged Biggie to record songs that contained thinly veiled threats against West Coast artists, and he had organized promotional events that seemed designed to provoke confrontation. Some of Biggie's friends and family members later suggested that Sean's desire for publicity and profit had contributed to the dangerous environment that led to the shooting. Sean was always pushing for more drama, more conflict, recalled one of Biggie's childhood friends. But Sean's response to Biggie's death demonstrated both his emotional devastation and his remarkable ability to transform personal tragedy into commercial opportunity. Within hours of the shooting, he was already planning a tribute album that would honor Biggie's memory while positioning himself as the heir to his friend's cultural legacy. The creation of No Way Out, Sean's debut solo album, was an extraordinary example of his ability to manipulate emotion for commercial gain. The album's centerpiece, I'll Be Missing You, was a tribute to Biggie that sampled the Police's Every Breath You Take and featured vocals from Faith Evans and the group of 112. The song was undeniably moving, capturing the genuine grief that Sean felt over his friend's death. But the song's creation also revealed Sean's troubling tendency to exploit the people closest to him for his own benefit. Faith Evans, who was still mourning her husband's death, was pressured to record vocals for the tribute within days of the funeral. According to studio personnel, Sean became increasingly demanding during the recording process, insisting on multiple takes and extended studio sessions, despite Faith's obvious emotional distress. "It was heartbreaking to watch," recalled a sound engineer who worked on the album. Faith was barely holding it together, and Sean was pushing her to deliver more emotion, more pain. The commercial success of I'll Be Missing You was unprecedented. The song debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the first hip-hop song to achieve that distinction. It remained at the top of the charts for 11 weeks and won the Grammy Award for Best Rap Performance by a Duo or Group. The album No Way Out sold over 7 million copies and established Sean as a major recording artist in his own right. But the success also marked the beginning of a new phase in Sean's career that would be characterized by increasingly grandiose behavior and a growing sense of invincibility. He was no longer just a behind-the-scenes executive. He was a celebrity whose personal life was scrutinized by the media and whose every move was analyzed by fans and critics. The transformation from executive to celebrity required Sean to develop new skills and adopt new strategies for controlling his public image. He hired a team of publicists, stylists, and image consultants whose job was to ensure that every aspect of his public persona was carefully managed. But he also began using his celebrity status to gain access to new circles of power and influence. The parties that Sean threw during the late 1990s became legendary in entertainment circles, attracting celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who were eager to associate with his success. But these events also became more elaborate and controlling, with guest lists that were carefully curated and activities that were sometimes recorded without the knowledge or consent of attendees. The most troubling aspect of Sean's celebrity lifestyle was his increasing use of wealth and influence to control the people around him. He began offering financial support to struggling artists, models, and actors, but that support came with strings attached that were not immediately apparent to the recipients. Several women who attended Sean's parties during this period later described experiences that would foreshadow the criminal behavior that would eventually lead to his arrest. They were invited to exclusive events, treated with apparent kindness and generosity, and then gradually pressured to participate in activities that made them uncomfortable. "He had this way of making you feel special, like you were part of an exclusive club," recalled one woman who attended multiple parties at Sean's homes during the late 1990s. But there was always this underlying pressure to go along with whatever he wanted. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Sean would use his wealth and influence to create environments where normal social boundaries were eroded and where participants felt obligated to comply with his requests, regardless of their personal comfort levels. His romantic relationships during this period followed a similar pattern. After the on and off relationship with Kim Porter, Sean began dating other high profile women, including the actress and singer Jennifer Lopez. The relationship with Lopez, which began in 1999, would prove to be particularly significant because it would introduce Sean to new levels of celebrity and influence. But it would also expose him to legal scrutiny that would foreshadow his future problems. The relationship with Lopez was intense and highly publicized, with the couple appearing together at numerous red carpet events and becoming fixtures in celebrity magazines. But those close to the couple described a dynamic that was troubling, with Sean exhibiting the same controlling behavior that had characterized his previous relationships. Lopez's friends and family members later described their concerns about Sean's treatment of the actress. He demanded to know her whereabouts at all times, monitored her phone calls, and expressed explosive anger when she attempted to maintain independence. He was charming in public, but in private he was possessive and controlling, recalled a friend of Lopez's who requested anonymity. The relationship would end dramatically in 2001, following the infamous nightclub shooting incident that would provide the first major test of Sean's ability to use his wealth and influence to escape legal consequences. The incident, which occurred at Club New York in Manhattan in December 1999, would establish a pattern of behavior that would continue for the next 2 decades. On the night of December 27, 1999, Sean and Lopez attended a party at Club New York, accompanied by Sean's bodyguard and driver. According to witnesses, Sean became involved in an altercation with another patron, and shots were fired, injuring 3 people. Sean, Lopez, and their companions fled the scene, but they were arrested the following morning. The legal case that followed would provide a template for how Sean would handle future legal challenges. He hired a team of expensive lawyers, launched a media campaign to shape public opinion, and used his influence to pressure witnesses and potential witnesses. The tactics were largely successful. Sean was acquitted of all charges, while his associate, Jamal Shine Barrow, was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But the case also revealed troubling aspects of Sean's character that would become more pronounced over time. Several witnesses reported that Sean had attempted to bribe them to change their testimony, and others described being threatened or intimidated by associates of Sean's. The accusations were never proven in court, but they established a pattern of behavior that would be repeated in future legal challenges. The acquittal in the Club New York case reinforced Sean's belief that he was above the law and that his wealth and influence could protect him from the consequences of his actions. This belief would prove to be both accurate and dangerous, enabling him to engage in increasingly risky behavior while maintaining the illusion of invincibility. The end of his relationship with Jennifer Lopez in 2001 marked the conclusion of one phase of Sean's life and the beginning of another. He had successfully transformed himself from music executive to international celebrity, but the process had also revealed the full extent of his controlling and manipulative behavior. The next phase of his career would be characterized by even greater commercial success and cultural influence, but it would also involve the development of the systematic abuse and exploitation that would eventually lead to his downfall. The empire he was building was reaching its peak, but the foundation was already beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. The business empire. Building a billion-dollar platform for control. By 2005, Sean Combs had accomplished something unprecedented in hip-hop history. He had transformed himself from a music executive into a multimedia mogul whose influence extended far beyond the recording industry. His empire now encompassed fashion, spirits, media, and lifestyle brands that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. But what the public didn't realize was that this business empire was also serving as a sophisticated platform for the systematic abuse and exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The expansion of Sean's business interests began with the launch of Sean John, his fashion line, in 1998. The brand was initially conceived as a natural extension of his influence in hip-hop culture, but it quickly evolved into something much more ambitious. Sean didn't just want to create clothing, he wanted to redefine how hip hop culture was perceived and consumed by mainstream America. The development of Sean John revealed Sean's extraordinary business acumen, but it also demonstrated his willingness to exploit anyone who stood in the way of his vision. The brand's early success was built on the work of talented designers and marketers who were often uncredited and underpaid. Several former employees later described a workplace culture that was simultaneously creative and abusive, where innovative ideas were encouraged, but personal boundaries were routinely violated. Sean had this way of making you feel like you were part of something revolutionary, recalled a former Sean John designer who requested anonymity. But he also made it clear that your job, your career, your entire future depended on keeping him happy. The designer described instances where Sean would demand that employees work extreme hours without additional compensation, require them to attend personal events unrelated to their job duties, and subject them to verbal abuse when they failed to meet his expectations. More troubling were reports of Sean using his position to pressure female employees into uncomfortable situations, including private meetings at his residences and attendance at parties where professional and personal boundaries were deliberately blurred. The success of Sean John provided Sean with a new level of legitimacy in the broader business world. The brand won the Council of Fashion Designers of America, CFDA, award for Menswear Designer of the Year in 2004, making Sean the first African American to receive the honor. The recognition opened doors to new business opportunities and partnerships that would exponentially increase his wealth and influence. But the CFDA award also marked the beginning of a new phase in Sean's evolution as a predator. The recognition gave him access to circles of power and influence that he had never previously encountered, including relationships with politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who were far removed from the hip-hop world where his behavior was already well known. The launch of his partnership with Diageo to promote Ciroc vodka in 2007 would prove to be the most financially significant decision of Sean's career. The deal, which was structured as a strategic partnership rather than a traditional endorsement, gave Sean unprecedented control over the brand's marketing and positioning. More importantly, it provided him with the financial resources to expand his platform for abuse to a global scale. The Ciroc partnership was revolutionary in its scope and structure. Rather than simply paying Sean to endorse the product, Diageo essentially gave him control over the brand's identity and marketing strategy. Sean transformed Ciroc from a relatively unknown premium vodka into a cultural phenomenon, using his influence in hip-hop and celebrity culture to position the brand as the drink of choice for successful, aspirational consumers. The marketing campaigns for Ciroc were masterclasses in cultural manipulation, but they also served as recruiting tools for Sean's increasingly elaborate system of abuse. The brand's promotional events, held at exclusive venues around the world, became opportunities for Sean to identify and groom potential victims. Young women who attended these events were often offered modeling opportunities, introduction to celebrities, and access to exclusive parties that seemed like career opportunities but were actually entry points into Sean's web of control. The financial success of the Ciroc partnership was extraordinary. Court documents filed in 2023 revealed that Diageo had paid Sean over $1 billion between 2007 and 2023, making him one of the highest-paid celebrities in the world. But the money also provided him with the resources to create an infrastructure of abuse that was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. The expansion of Sean's business empire during this period was accompanied by the development of what prosecutors would later describe as a criminal enterprise that used legitimate business activities to facilitate systematic abuse. The recording studios, event venues, and residential properties that Sean owned or controlled were equipped with surveillance systems, soundproofing, and other features that enabled him to monitor and control the behavior of anyone who entered his sphere of influence. The most troubling aspect of Sean's business operations during this period was his systematic exploitation of aspiring artists and entertainers. Bad Boy Records continued to sign new talent, but the contracts and working relationships that Sean established with these artists were designed to create financial and psychological dependency that made it difficult for them to leave his organization. Sean controlled every aspect of her career, from her musical choices to her personal relationships, and he used his power to isolate her from friends and family members who might have questioned his behavior. He made me feel like I was nothing without him, O'Day recalled. He would build me up and tear me down, sometimes in the same conversation. The pattern of abuse that O'Day described was repeated with numerous other artists, models, and entertainers who became associated with Sean's various business ventures. The system was sophisticated and psychologically manipulative, designed to create dependency and compliance rather than relying solely on physical intimidation. The development of Revolt TV, Sean's cable television network, provided him with yet another platform for identifying and grooming potential victims. The network, which launched in 2013, was positioned as a vehicle for promoting hip-hop culture and providing opportunities for emerging artists and media personalities. But it also served as a recruitment tool for Sean's increasingly elaborate system of abuse. Young women who applied for positions at Revolt TV were often subjected to interviews and auditions that were designed to assess their willingness to comply with Sean's demands rather than their professional qualifications. The most disturbing aspect of Sean's business empire was his use of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, to silence victims and prevent them from reporting his behavior. The NDAs were typically presented as standard business practices, but they were actually sophisticated legal instruments designed to prevent victims from seeking help or reporting crimes. The agreements were often bundled with financial settlements or business opportunities that made them difficult to refuse. A struggling artist might be offered a recording contract along with an NDA, or a model might receive a lucrative endorsement deal that required her to sign away her right to discuss her experiences with Sean. The result was a system that enabled Sean to abuse victims while ensuring their silence. The effectiveness of this system was demonstrated by the fact that despite decades of widespread rumors about Sean's behavior, no major media outlet was able to publish detailed accounts of his crimes until 2023. The combination of legal intimidation, financial incentives, and cultural influence created a protective barrier that allowed Sean to operate with impunity for over 2 decades. The business empire that Sean built during this period was genuinely impressive from a commercial perspective. By 2022, Forbes estimated his net worth at $1 billion, making him one of the wealthiest figures in hip-hop history. His influence extended far beyond music into fashion, spirits, media, and other industries, and his success had made him a role model for aspiring entrepreneurs around the world. But the empire was also a carefully constructed platform for systematic abuse that enabled Sean to victimize hundreds of individuals while maintaining the facade of a successful businessman and cultural icon. The very success that made him admired and envied also provided him with the resources and influence necessary to prey on vulnerable people while avoiding accountability. The most tragic aspect of Sean's business empire was that it represented a perversion of the legitimate achievements that hip-hop culture had made possible. Sean had genuinely contributed to the mainstream acceptance of hip-hop and had created opportunities for artists and entrepreneurs who might otherwise have been excluded from traditional business networks. But he had also used those same achievements to create a system of exploitation that victimized the very communities he claimed to represent. The empire he built would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, but not before causing immeasurable harm to countless individuals whose trust and aspirations were exploited for the benefit of a single man's twisted vision of power and control. The freak-off system, a criminal enterprise disguised as entertainment. The term freak-off would not enter the public consciousness until federal prosecutors used it in their 2024 indictment of Sean Combs, but the system of abuse that the term described had been operating for over a decade, hidden behind the glamorous facade of Sean's entertainment empire. What federal investigators eventually uncovered was not simply a pattern of individual crimes, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used legitimate business activities to facilitate systematic sexual abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. The origins of the freak-off system can be traced back to the early 2000s, when Sean began hosting private parties at his various residences that were markedly different from his public promotional events. These gatherings were invitation-only affairs that brought together carefully selected groups of individuals, including celebrities, business associates, and young women who were often aspiring models or entertainers. The initial parties appeared to be typical celebrity gatherings with expensive alcohol, elaborate catering, and high-profile guests. But former attendees later described an atmosphere that was carefully orchestrated to break down social inhibitions and create situations where normal boundaries were eroded. The parties would typically begin as conventional social events, but they would gradually evolve into something much more sinister. The transformation of these gatherings from social events into criminal enterprises was gradual and calculated. He would then gradually escalate the activities, introducing sexual themes and encouraging increasingly intimate interactions between guests. The most disturbing aspect of these parties was Sean's use of recording equipment to document the activities. Initially, he claimed that the recordings were for artistic purposes or documentary projects. But it eventually became clear that the recordings were being used as blackmail material to ensure the compliance of participants. Federal investigators later discovered that Sean had accumulated thousands of hours of recordings from these parties, many of which showed celebrities, politicians, and business leaders in compromising situations. The recordings served multiple purposes. They provided Sean with entertainment, they could be used to blackmail participants into compliance with his demands, and they could be sold or distributed to generate additional revenue. The evolution of the freak-off system accelerated in the late 2000s. As Sean's business empire expanded and his financial resources grew, the parties became more elaborate and more explicitly sexual, with Sean recruiting young women to participate in activities that were increasingly abusive and exploitative. The recruitment process was sophisticated and predatory, targeting vulnerable individuals who were seeking career opportunities in the entertainment industry. Sean would identify aspiring models, actresses, and singers who were struggling financially or professionally, and he would offer them opportunities that seemed legitimate but were actually entry points into his system of abuse. The initial contact would typically be made through legitimate business channels, such as modeling agencies or talent scouts who were associated with Sean's various companies. The women would be invited to parties or events that were presented as networking opportunities, and they would be gradually introduced to Sean's inner circle. The grooming process was carefully orchestrated to create psychological dependency and compliance. Sean would begin by offering small favors or opportunities, such as introductions to industry professionals or invitations to exclusive events. He would then gradually escalate his demands, using a combination of rewards and punishments to condition the women to comply with his requests. The most insidious aspect of the grooming process was Sean's use of legitimate business opportunities to create the illusion of mutual benefit. A young woman might be offered a modeling contract or a role in a music video, but the contract would contain clauses that gave Sean extensive control over her activities and appearance. What appeared to be a career opportunity was actually a mechanism for establishing dominance and control. The freak-off events themselves were elaborate productions that required extensive planning and resources. Sean would typically hold these events at his residences in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami, which were equipped with specialized rooms that were designed to facilitate the activities. The rooms contained recording equipment, specialized lighting, and other features that enabled Sean to document and control every aspect of the proceedings. The participants in these events were typically divided into different categories. Some were celebrities or business associates who were attending for networking purposes and who might not have been aware of the true nature of the activities. Others were young women who had been recruited specifically to participate in sexual activities. Still others were male escorts or sex workers who were hired to perform with the women while Sean watched and recorded. The most disturbing aspect of the freak-off system was its systematic nature. These were not isolated incidents of abuse, but carefully orchestrated events that were designed to maximize Sean's control and minimize the possibility of resistance or exposure. The activities were planned in advance with detailed scripts and scenarios that dictated how participants should behave. The use of drugs was a central component of the freak-off system. Sean would typically provide participants with alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, and other substances that were designed to reduce inhibitions and impair judgment. The drugs were often presented as party favors or creative aids, but they were actually tools for facilitating abuse and ensuring compliance. Federal investigators later discovered that Sean had maintained detailed records of the drugs that were distributed at these events, including the types of substances, the quantities provided, and the effects on individual participants. The record suggested that the drug distribution was not random or recreational, but part of a systematic effort to identify substances that would be most effective for controlling behavior. The recording and distribution of the freak-off activities constituted a separate criminal enterprise that generated significant revenue for Sean's organization. The recordings were edited and packaged for distribution to paying customers, who included wealthy individuals, celebrities, and others who were willing to pay premium prices for exclusive content. The distribution network was sophisticated and international, with customers in the United States, Europe, and Asia. The recordings were sold through encrypted channels and private networks that were designed to avoid detection by law enforcement. The revenue generated by these sales was laundered through Sean's legitimate business enterprises, making it difficult to trace the source of the income. The most tragic aspect of the freak-off system was its impact on the women who were coerced into participating. Many of these women were young, vulnerable, and seeking career opportunities in the entertainment industry. They were systematically exploited and abused, often for years while being isolated from friends and family members who might have been able to help them. The psychological impact of the abuse was severe and long-lasting. Many of the women developed substance abuse problems, mental health issues, and other problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some attempted to escape from Sean's control, but they were often threatened with violence, legal action, or career destruction if they tried to leave. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating, with victims often being coerced into recruiting new participants. Women who had been abused were sometimes given financial incentives or other rewards for identifying potential new victims, creating a cycle of exploitation that expanded the system's reach. The freak-off system operated for over a decade without being exposed, protected by a combination of legal intimidation, financial incentives, and cultural influence. The participants were bound by non-disclosure agreements, threatened with legal action if they spoke out, and isolated from potential sources of support and assistance. The system's eventual exposure would come not through law enforcement investigation, but through the courage of individual victims who were willing to come forward despite the risks. The collapse of the system would be sudden and dramatic, but the harm that it caused would continue to reverberate for years to come. The Cassie-Ventura relationship, a decade of systematic abuse. The relationship between Sean Combs and Cassie Ventura began in 2005 as what appeared to be a typical music industry romance between a powerful executive and a rising star. Cassie, then 19 years old, was a stunningly beautiful aspiring singer and model who had caught Sean's attention through her work with producer Ryan Leslie. But what began as a professional relationship would evolve into a decade-long nightmare of systematic abuse, control, and exploitation that would eventually provide the roadmap for federal prosecutors to dismantle Sean's criminal enterprise. Cassie's entry into Sean's orbit was facilitated by her youth, beauty, and vulnerability. She was a young woman from Connecticut who had moved to New York City to pursue her dreams in the entertainment industry. She was talented, ambitious, and naive about the darker aspects of the business she was entering. Sean, then 36 years old, recognized her potential not just as an artist, but as a victim who could be molded to serve his twisted needs. The initial phase of their relationship followed the pattern that Sean had established with previous victims. He was charming, generous, and apparently supportive of Cassie's career aspirations. He signed her to Bad Boy Records and began working on her debut album, which would eventually be released in 2006. The album's lead single, Me and You, became a major hit, reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and establishing Cassie as a rising star in the music industry. But even during this early phase, there were signs of the controlling behavior that would come to define their relationship. Sean insisted on being involved in every aspect of Cassie's life, from her musical choices to her personal relationships. He monitored her phone calls, controlled her social media accounts, and required her to seek his approval before making any public appearances. The transformation of their relationship from professional to personal was gradual and calculated. Sean began by offering Cassie opportunities that were contingent on her spending time with him outside of work. He would invite her to parties and events that were presented as networking opportunities, but that were actually designed to isolate her from her friends and family. The sexual component of their relationship began in 2007, when Cassie was 21 years old and Sean was 38. The 17-year age difference created an inherent power imbalance that Sean exploited from the beginning. He used his experience, wealth, and influence to control every aspect of their sexual relationship, introducing elements of abuse and degradation that would escalate over time. The most disturbing aspect of Sean's relationship with Cassie was his systematic use of her as a test subject for the abusive practices that he would later inflict on other victims. The techniques that he developed to control and abuse Cassie would become the template for his treatment of countless other women over the following decade. The control that Sean exerted over Cassie's life was comprehensive and suffocating. He dictated her wardrobe choices, monitored her diet and exercise routines, and controlled her access to friends and family members. He moved her into his residence, ostensibly for convenience and security, but actually to ensure that she remained under his constant supervision. The physical abuse began gradually with Sean using his superior size and strength to intimidate and control Cassie. He would grab her arms, push her against walls, and use other forms of physical intimidation to reinforce his dominance. The abuse escalated over time, with Sean becoming increasingly violent when Cassie attempted to assert any independence. The sexual abuse was even more systematic and degrading. Sean forced Cassie to participate in the freak-off activities that he was developing for his entertainment and that of his guests. She was required to engage in sexual activities with male escorts and sex workers while Sean watched and recorded. The recordings were used both for Sean's personal entertainment and as blackmail material to ensure Cassie's continued compliance. The psychological abuse was perhaps the most damaging aspect of their relationship. Sean used a combination of gaslighting, isolation, and financial dependency to break down Cassie's sense of self and her ability to resist his demands. He would tell her that she was worthless without him, that her career success was entirely due to his efforts, and that she would be nothing if she ever left him. The financial control was equally comprehensive. Sean controlled all of Cassie's earnings from her music career, doling out money to her in small amounts and requiring her to justify every expense. He used financial dependency as a tool to ensure her compliance, making it clear that any attempt to leave him would result in financial ruin. The most insidious aspect of Sean's abuse of Cassie was his use of their relationship to facilitate the abuse of other women. Cassie was often required to participate in the recruitment of new victims, using her status as Sean's girlfriend to lure young women into his sphere of influence. She was forced to participate in freak-off events with other women, normalizing the abuse and making it seem like acceptable behavior. The recording of these activities was a constant source of humiliation and control for Cassie. Sean would force her to watch recordings of her own abuse, using them to reinforce his dominance and to remind her of her powerlessness. The recordings also served as insurance against any potential resistance, as Sean made it clear that he would release them if Cassie ever attempted to leave him or report his behavior. The impact of this systematic abuse on Cassie was profound and devastating. She developed substance abuse problems, mental health issues, and a range of physical ailments that were directly related to the stress and trauma of her relationship with Sean. She was isolated from friends and family members, cut off from potential sources of support and assistance. The relationship was not continuous. There were periods when Cassie would attempt to break free from Sean's control, but these efforts were typically met with escalating abuse and threats. Sean would use his influence in the music industry to sabotage her career opportunities, making it clear that her professional survival depended on maintaining their relationship. The most tragic aspect of Cassie's situation was that her abuse was facilitated by the very industry that she had hoped would provide her with opportunities for success and fulfillment. The music industry's tolerance for abusive behavior, combined with Sean's wealth and influence, created an environment where his crimes could continue undetected for over a decade. The relationship between Sean and Cassie officially ended in 2018, but the trauma and damage caused by their decade-long relationship would continue to affect Cassie for years to come. She was left with physical and psychological scars that would require extensive treatment and support to heal. The decision to finally come forward with allegations against Sean in 2023 required extraordinary courage from Cassie. She faced the prospect of legal retaliation, public scrutiny, and the exposure of intimate details of her abuse. But she also recognized that her silence was enabling Sean to continue victimizing other women, and that her testimony might be the key to finally holding him accountable for his crimes. The lawsuit that Cassie filed in November 2023 would prove to be the catalyst that brought down Sean's criminal enterprise. The detailed allegations contained in the lawsuit provided federal prosecutors with a roadmap for their investigation, and the evidence that Cassie provided would become central to the criminal case against Sean. The settlement of Cassie's lawsuit for $20 million within 24 hours of its filing was intended to silence her and prevent further investigation. But the settlement had the opposite effect, encouraging other victims to come forward and providing federal prosecutors with the evidence they needed to build a comprehensive criminal case. The courage that Cassie demonstrated in coming forward would ultimately save countless other women from becoming victims of Sean's abuse. Her decision to break her silence, despite the personal cost, would prove to be the beginning of the end for one of the most sophisticated and long-running criminal enterprises in entertainment history. The hotel surveillance. When the mask finally slipped on March 5, 2016, security cameras at the Intercontinental Hotel in Century City, Los Angeles, captured footage that would eventually become the most damaging evidence in the federal case against Sean Combs. The 42-second video, which CNN would obtain and broadcast 8 years later, showed Sean in a towel chasing Cassie Ventura down a hotel hallway, grabbing her, throwing her to the ground, and kicking her while she lay defenseless. The footage was so shocking that it would fundamentally alter public perception of Sean and provide prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of his violent behavior. But the significance of the hotel surveillance footage extended far beyond its documentation of a single incident of domestic violence. The video represented the moment when Sean's carefully constructed public image finally collided with the reality of his private behavior, and it provided a rare glimpse into the systematic abuse that had been hidden behind the glamorous facade of his entertainment empire. The events leading up to the hotel incident were typical of the pattern of abuse that had defined Sean's relationship with Cassie for over a decade. According to Cassie's later testimony, Sean had been drinking heavily and using drugs during their stay at the hotel. He had become increasingly agitated and controlling, monitoring her phone calls and expressing anger about her communications with friends and family members. The specific trigger for the violence was Cassie's attempt to leave the hotel room without Sean's permission. She had been trying to distance herself from Sean's increasingly erratic behavior, and she had decided to go to the hotel lobby to call a friend. But Sean's need for control was so overwhelming that he could not tolerate even this minor assertion of independence. The footage showed Sean running down the hallway in pursuit of Cassie, his towel barely covering his body, and his face contorted with rage. When he caught up with her near the elevators, he grabbed her by the neck and threw her to the ground with such force that she lost one of her shoes. As she lay on the floor, apparently stunned by the impact, Sean kicked her in the ribs and stomach. The most chilling aspect of the footage was what it revealed about Sean's state of mind during the assault. His movements were deliberate and calculated, suggesting that this was not a momentary loss of control but a systematic attempt to punish Cassie for her disobedience. Even more disturbing was his behavior after the assault, as he calmly gathered Cassie's belongings and dragged her back to their room as if nothing had happened. The existence of the hotel surveillance footage was not immediately known to federal prosecutors or the media. The footage was stored in the hotel's security system, and it would likely have been deleted according to standard retention policies if not for the intervention of individuals who recognized its significance. The process by which the footage eventually came to light revealed the extensive efforts that Sean had made to control the narrative around his relationship with Cassie. Immediately after the incident, Sean's security team had contacted the hotel's management to inquire about the surveillance system. Within hours, representatives of Sean's organization had arrived at the hotel and attempted to obtain copies of the footage. The hotel's management, apparently recognizing the potential legal implications of the footage, declined to provide copies to Sean's representatives. But they also did not immediately report the incident to law enforcement, reflecting the music industry's traditional reluctance to become involved in the personal affairs of high-profile clients. The footage remained in the hotel's security system for several years, unknown to the public but potentially accessible to anyone who knew of its existence. The eventual disclosure of the footage to CNN in 2024 was the result of a complex investigation that involved multiple sources and extensive legal negotiations. The broadcast of the footage on CNN's programming had an immediate and devastating impact on Sean's public image. The video was so shocking and unambiguous that it made it impossible for Sean to deny or minimize his abusive behavior. The footage was viewed millions of times on social media, generating widespread condemnation from fans, fellow celebrities, and industry professionals. The response from Sean's representatives was initially defensive and evasive. They issued statements claiming that the footage was taken out of context and that Sean's behavior was not representative of his character. But as the public outrage intensified, Sean was forced to issue a public apology that acknowledged the severity of his actions. The apology, posted on Sean's social media accounts, was notable for its apparent contrition, but also for its careful legal language. Sean acknowledged that his behavior was inexcusable and expressed remorse for his actions, but he also avoided making any statements that could be used as admissions of guilt in potential legal proceedings. The timing of the footage's release was particularly damaging for Sean because it coincided with the federal investigation into his activities. The video provided prosecutors with compelling evidence of Sean's violent behavior, and it corroborated many of the allegations that had been made by Cassie and other victims. The footage also had a significant impact on Sean's business relationships. Several major brands immediately began distancing themselves from Sean, and some terminated their partnerships entirely. The video made it impossible for corporate partners to continue their associations with Sean without facing public criticism and potential boycotts. The most significant impact of the hotel surveillance footage was its effect on other potential victims of Sean's abuse. The video provided validation for women who had experienced similar treatment but had been afraid to come forward. It also demonstrated that Sean's behavior was not limited to private settings, but could occur in public spaces where it might be documented. The footage sparked a broader conversation about domestic violence and abuse in the entertainment industry. It highlighted the ways in which wealth and celebrity status could be used to conceal abusive behavior, and the importance of believing victims who came forward with allegations of abuse. The legal implications of the footage were significant and far-reaching. The video provided prosecutors with evidence of Sean's violent behavior that could be used to support charges of assault, domestic violence, and potentially other crimes. It also served as evidence of Sean's character and propensity for violence, which could be relevant to other charges in the federal case. The footage also had implications for civil lawsuits that had been filed against Sean. The video corroborated many of the allegations that had been made by Cassie and other victims, strengthening their cases and potentially increasing the damages that could be awarded. The discovery of the hotel surveillance footage represented a turning point in the federal investigation of Sean's activities. It provided prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of his violent behavior and helped to establish the credibility of other victims who had come forward with similar allegations. The footage also served as a stark reminder of the reality behind Sean's carefully constructed public image. For decades, he had been portrayed as a successful businessman and cultural icon, but the hotel surveillance footage revealed the true nature of his character and the extent of his abusive behavior. The impact of the footage would continue to reverberate throughout the federal case against Sean, providing a foundation for the prosecution's argument that his crimes were part of a systematic pattern of abuse and control. The 42 seconds of video had accomplished what years of rumors and allegations had failed to achieve. It had finally exposed Sean Combs for who he really was. The federal investigation, how the empire began to crumble. The federal investigation that would ultimately bring down Sean Combs began not with a dramatic raid or a high-profile arrest, but with a single phone call made to the FBI's New York field office on November 17, 2023, just one day after Cassie Ventura filed her bombshell lawsuit. The caller was a former employee of Sean's organization who had been haunted by what they had witnessed during their time working for the music mogul, and who finally felt empowered to speak out after seeing Cassie's courage in coming forward. That phone call would initiate an investigation that would span 8 months, involve hundreds of federal agents, and ultimately uncover what prosecutors would describe as one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American entertainment history. The investigation would reveal a pattern of abuse, exploitation, and criminal behavior that extended far beyond what had been alleged in Cassie's lawsuit and it would demonstrate the extraordinary lengths to which Sean had gone to conceal his crimes. The initial response to the federal investigation was swift and decisive. Within hours of receiving the tip, FBI agents had begun reviewing financial records, communications, and other evidence related to Sean's business activities. The scope of the investigation was immediately expanded to include not just allegations of domestic violence and sexual abuse, but potential charges of racketeering, sex trafficking, and money laundering. The complexity of the investigation was unprecedented in the entertainment industry. Sean's business empire encompassed dozens of companies, hundreds of employees, and business relationships that spanned multiple countries. The financial records alone represented thousands of documents that had to be reviewed, analyzed, and cross-referenced to identify patterns of criminal behavior. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The team of investigators included specialists in financial crimes, sex trafficking, and organized crime, reflecting the multifaceted nature of the allegations against Sean. The first major breakthrough in the investigation came from the analysis of Sean's financial records. Investigators discovered a complex web of payments that had been made to individuals who appeared to be victims of his abuse. The payments were often disguised as business expenses or charitable donations, but the pattern suggested a systematic effort to silence victims and prevent them from reporting Sean's crimes. The financial investigation also revealed the extent of Sean's wealth and the sophisticated methods he had used to conceal his assets. He had established offshore accounts, shell companies, and other financial structures that were designed to make it difficult for investigators to trace the source and disposition of his funds. The second major breakthrough came from the analysis of Sean's communications. Investigators obtained warrants to search his phones, computers, and other electronic devices, uncovering thousands of text messages, emails, and other communications that provided insight into his criminal activities. The communications revealed a pattern of behavior that was consistent with the allegations made by Cassie and other victims. Sean had used his phones to coordinate abusive activities, to threaten and intimidate victims, and to arrange payments designed to ensure their silence. The messages also revealed the extent of his paranoia and his awareness that his behavior was criminal. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Sean's use of technology to facilitate his crimes. He had installed surveillance equipment in his residences and business properties, apparently to monitor the activities of his employees and associates. The surveillance footage that was recovered by investigators provided additional evidence of his abusive behavior and his attempts to control the people around him. The most significant development in the investigation was the decision by additional victims to come forward. The publicity surrounding Cassie's lawsuit and the federal investigation had encouraged other women to report their experiences with Sean. By the time of his arrest in September 2024, over 70 civil lawsuits had been filed against him, representing dozens of additional victims. The testimony of these additional victims provided investigators with a comprehensive picture of Sean's criminal enterprise. The victims described similar patterns of abuse, grooming, and control that had been employed by Sean over a period of more than 2 decades. The consistency of their accounts strengthened the prosecution's case and provided corroboration for the allegations that had been made by Cassie. The investigation also revealed the extent of Sean's efforts to obstruct justice and interfere with the legal process. He had used his wealth and influence to pressure victims not to cooperate with investigators, and he had attempted to intimidate witnesses who might have provided evidence against him. The coordination of the investigation required unprecedented cooperation between federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations. Sean's business activities had extended to multiple countries, and some of his alleged crimes had occurred overseas. The investigation involved the FBI, DEA, IRS, and other federal agencies, as well as law enforcement organizations in the United Kingdom, Canada, and other countries. The scope of the investigation was further complicated by the involvement of numerous celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who had been associated with Sean's activities. Many of these individuals were potential witnesses who could provide evidence about Sean's behavior, but they were also potential victims who might have been reluctant to come forward due to concerns about publicity and reputation. The investigation culminated in the coordinated raids on Sean's properties in Los Angeles and Miami on March 25, 2024. The raids were conducted by teams of federal agents who had been preparing for months. and they resulted in the seizure of massive amounts of evidence that would support the prosecution's case. The evidence seized during the raids included financial records, communications, surveillance footage, and physical evidence related to Sean's criminal activities. The agents also seized weapons, drugs, and other items that demonstrated the extent of Sean's criminal enterprise. The raids were conducted with military precision, reflecting the seriousness of the allegations against Sean and the potential danger that he might have posed to investigators. The agents were prepared for the possibility that Sean might attempt to destroy evidence or flee the country, but the raids were executed without incident. The aftermath of the raids was swift and decisive. Sean's business partners began distancing themselves from him, and several major brands terminated their relationships with his companies. The raids had effectively ended Sean's career in the entertainment industry, even before formal charges had been filed. The federal investigation represented a watershed moment in the entertainment industry's reckoning with abusive behavior. The scope and sophistication of the investigation demonstrated that law enforcement was finally taking seriously the allegations of abuse that had long been dismissed as rumors or isolated incidents. The investigation also highlighted the importance of victims' courage in coming forward. Without the testimony of Cassie and other victims, the investigation would not have been possible. Their willingness to speak out, despite the personal cost, had finally made it possible to hold Sean accountable for his crimes. The federal investigation had achieved what years of rumors and allegations had failed to accomplish. It had exposed the true nature of Sean's criminal enterprise and set in motion the legal process that would ultimately bring him to justice. The empire that had taken decades to build was finally beginning to crumble, and the man who had once seemed untouchable was about to face the consequences of his actions. The Raids. Dawn of Reckoning. At precisely 6:01 a.m. on March 25, 2024, federal agents began the most significant raid in entertainment industry history. Simultaneously, teams of FBI agents, DEA officers, and other federal law enforcement personnel descended upon Sean Combs's properties in Los Angeles and Miami, executing search warrants that would yield evidence of crimes spanning more than 2 decades. The planning for the raids had been meticulous and extensive. For months, federal investigators had been studying the layout of Sean's properties, identifying potential evidence locations, and preparing for the possibility that Sean might attempt to destroy evidence or flee the country. The raids were coordinated to the minute, ensuring that Sean could not communicate between his properties or warn associates about the impending searches. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Over 200 federal agents participated in the raids, supported by local law enforcement and specialized units trained in handling complex financial crimes and digital evidence. The agents were equipped with warrants that authorized them to search not just Sean's residences, but also his recording studios, offices, and other business properties. The Los Angeles raid began at Sean's $40 million mansion in Holmby Hills, a 17,000 square foot estate that had served as both his residence and a center for his entertainment activities. The property, which included multiple buildings, recording studios, and extensive grounds, required dozens of agents to search thoroughly. The Miami raid was conducted simultaneously at Sean's $35 million mansion on Star Island, a luxury enclave in Biscayne Bay. The waterfront property, which featured a private dock and beach access, was particularly challenging to secure due to its multiple escape routes and the need to coordinate with Coast Guard vessels to prevent any attempt to flee by water. The agents' discovery at both properties had exceeded even their most pessimistic expectations. The Los Angeles mansion yielded what prosecutors would later describe as a warehouse of evidence documenting Sean's criminal activities. In a specially constructed room in the basement, agents found over 1,000 bottles of baby oil and personal lubricant, along with drugs, sex toys, and other items that were clearly intended for the freak-off activities that had been described by victims. The Miami property revealed an even more disturbing cache of evidence. Agents discovered a sophisticated recording studio that had been modified with hidden cameras and audio equipment, allowing Sean to record activities throughout the property without the knowledge of participants. The digital storage devices found at the property contained thousands of hours of recordings, many of which showed celebrities, politicians, and other high-profile individuals in compromising situations. The weapons discovered during the raids were particularly alarming. Agents found 3 AR-15 rifles with defaced serial numbers, along with ammunition and other weapons that suggested Sean had been prepared for potential violence. The discovery of illegal weapons added federal firearms charges to the growing list of crimes that Sean would face. The financial evidence seized during the raids was equally damning. Agents discovered records of payments totaling millions of dollars to individuals who appeared to be victims of Sean's abuse. The payments were often disguised as business expenses or charitable donations, but the pattern suggested a systematic effort to silence victims and prevent them from reporting Sean's crimes. The digital evidence was perhaps the most significant discovery. Agents seized dozens of computers, phones, and storage devices that contained communications, financial records, and other evidence of Sean's criminal activities. The analysis of this digital evidence would take months, but it would ultimately provide prosecutors with a comprehensive picture of Sean's criminal enterprise. The raids also uncovered evidence of Sean's attempts to obstruct justice and interfere with the ongoing federal investigation. Agents found communications showing that Sean had been attempting to pressure victims not to cooperate with investigators and that he had been trying to intimidate witnesses who might have provided evidence against him. The immediate aftermath of the raids was chaotic and dramatic. Sean was not present at either property during the searches, but his adult sons, Justin and Christian Combs, were detained and questioned by agents. The detention of his sons was particularly traumatic for Sean, who had always been protective of his family's privacy and reputation. The media coverage of the raids was intense and immediate. News helicopters circled both properties, broadcasting live footage of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from Sean's mansions. The images of his luxurious properties being searched by armed federal agents created a powerful visual representation of his fall from grace. The raids had an immediate and devastating impact on Sean's business empire. Within hours of the searches, major corporate partners began distancing themselves from Sean and his companies. Stock prices of publicly traded companies that had partnerships with Sean's businesses began to decline, and several major brands announced that they were reviewing their relationships with his organization. The psychological impact of the raids on Sean was profound. For decades, he had lived in a world where his wealth and influence had protected him from consequences. The sight of federal agents searching his properties and seizing his possessions represented a fundamental shift in his reality, one that would force him to confront the possibility that he might finally be held accountable for his actions. The raids also had a significant impact on Sean's alleged victims. For many women who had been abused by Sean, the sight of federal agents taking his organization seriously represented a validation of their experiences and a hope that justice might finally be possible. The raids encouraged additional victims to come forward, providing prosecutors with even more evidence of Sean's criminal behavior. The legal implications of the raids were immediate and far-reaching. The evidence seized during the searches would form the foundation of the federal case against Sean, and the scope of the evidence suggested that the charges would be extensive and serious. The raids also demonstrated the federal government's commitment to prosecuting Sean to the fullest extent of the law. The raids marked a turning point in the federal investigation. The evidence seized during the searches provided prosecutors with the proof they needed to bring formal charges against Sean, and the publicity surrounding the raids made it clear that he would no longer be able to operate his criminal enterprise with impunity. The coordination and execution of the raids demonstrated the professionalism and competence of the federal law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation. The agents had successfully seized massive amounts of evidence while ensuring the safety of all involved, and they had done so in a manner that preserved the integrity of the evidence for use in future legal proceedings. The raids also highlighted the importance of the federal investigation in bringing Sean to justice. The scope and sophistication of his criminal enterprise had made it impossible for local law enforcement to address his crimes effectively. Only the resources and authority of the federal government had made it possible to conduct the kind of comprehensive investigation that was necessary to hold Sean accountable. The evidence seized during the raids would ultimately form the backbone of the federal case against Sean. The recordings, financial records, communications, and other materials provided prosecutors with a comprehensive picture of his criminal activities, and they would be used to support charges of racketeering, sex trafficking, and other serious crimes. The raids represented the beginning of the end for Sean's criminal empire. The evidence seized during the searches would make it impossible for him to continue his abusive activities, and the publicity surrounding the raids would make it impossible for him to maintain his public image as a successful businessman and cultural icon. The indictment, Anatomy of a Criminal Enterprise. On September 16, 2024, a federal grand jury in the Southern District of New York returned a 27-page indictment against Sean Combs that would forever change how the entertainment industry understood the relationship between power, wealth, and criminal behavior. The document, officially titled United States of America versus Sean Combs, outlined charges that were breathtaking in their scope and detail, describing not just individual crimes, but a systematic criminal enterprise that had operated for over 15 years. The indictment was the culmination of 8 months of intensive investigation, involving hundreds of federal agents, prosecutors, and support staff. The document represented thousands of hours of analysis, testimony from dozens of witnesses, and review of massive amounts of physical and digital evidence. But more than that, it represented the federal government's determination to hold Sean accountable for crimes that had been hidden behind the facade of legitimate business activities. The three primary charges outlined in the indictment were each significant enough to destroy Sean's life and legacy. The first charge, racketeering conspiracy under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO Act, alleged that Sean had operated a criminal enterprise through his various businesses and associates. The RICO charge was particularly significant because it treated Sean's abusive behavior not as isolated incidents, but as part of a systematic pattern of criminal activity. The second charge, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, alleged that Sean had transported women across state lines for the purpose of engaging in commercial sexual activity. The charge was based on evidence that Sean had used his wealth and influence to coerce women into participating in sexual activities for his benefit and the benefit of others. The third charge, transportation to engage in prostitution, alleged that Sean had knowingly transported individuals across state lines with the intent that they engage in prostitution. This charge was based on evidence that Sean had arranged for male escorts and other individuals to travel to locations where they would participate in sexual activities with women who were being coerced or abused. Each of these charges carried severe penalties. The RICO charge alone carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, while the sex trafficking charges carried potential life sentences. The combination of charges meant that Sean faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison if convicted on all counts. The indictment's description of Sean's criminal enterprise was detailed and damning. According to prosecutors, Sean had used his legitimate businesses, including Bad Boy Records, Sean John Clothing, and his various media ventures, to facilitate and conceal his criminal activities. The businesses provided him with the financial resources, personnel, and infrastructure necessary to operate his criminal enterprise. The document described how Sean had used his employees to arrange travel, book hotel rooms, and coordinate other logistics for his criminal activities. The employees were often unaware of the true purpose of their activities, but they were essential to the operation of Sean's criminal enterprise. The indictment alleged that Sean had essentially corrupted his entire business organization, turning legitimate companies into tools for facilitating abuse and exploitation. The indictment's description of the freak-off activities was particularly detailed and disturbing. According to the document, Sean had organized elaborate sexual performances that were recorded and sometimes broadcast to paying customers. The activities involved the use of drugs, coercion, and violence to ensure the compliance of participants, and they were often conducted in locations that were specifically designed to facilitate recording and control. The document alleged that Sean had maintained detailed records of these activities, including financial records of payments made to participants, drug dealers, and other individuals involved in the criminal enterprise. The records suggested that the freak-off activities were not impulsive or recreational, but were carefully planned and executed as part of a commercial operation. The indictment also detailed Sean's efforts to obstruct justice and interfere with the federal investigation. The document alleged that Sean had attempted to bribe witnesses, intimidate potential cooperators, and destroy evidence that might have been used against him. These efforts to obstruct justice were treated as separate criminal acts that could result in additional charges and penalties. The financial scope of Sean's criminal enterprise was staggering. The indictment alleged that Sean had used millions of dollars to facilitate his criminal activities, including payments to victims, expenses for freak-off activities, and bribes to ensure the silence of witnesses. The money had been laundered through his legitimate businesses, making it difficult for investigators to trace the source and purpose of the funds. The indictment's description of Sean's treatment of victims was particularly heartbreaking. The document alleged that Sean had used a combination of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and financial coercion to control his victims. He had isolated them from friends and family, controlled their access to money and resources, and threatened them with violence or career destruction if they attempted to escape or report his behavior. The document described how Sean had used his celebrity status and industry connections to lure victims into his sphere of influence. Young women who were seeking careers in entertainment were particularly vulnerable to his manipulation, as they were often desperate for opportunities and willing to tolerate abusive behavior in exchange for potential career advancement. The indictment also detailed Sean's use of technology to facilitate his crimes. He had installed surveillance equipment in his properties, monitored the communications of his victims and associates, and used digital devices to record and distribute evidence of his criminal activities. The technology had made his criminal enterprise more sophisticated and more difficult to detect, but it had also created a digital trail that would ultimately provide prosecutors with crucial evidence. The international scope of Sean's criminal enterprise was also addressed in the indictment. The document alleged that Sean had transported victims and facilitated criminal activities in multiple countries, including the United Kingdom, Canada, and several Caribbean nations. The international nature of his crimes had made the investigation more complex, but it had also exposed him to additional federal charges and penalties. The indictment's treatment of Sean's co-conspirators was notable for its breadth and detail. The document alleged that Sean had worked with dozens of individuals, including employees, associates, and service providers, to facilitate his criminal activities. Many of these individuals were not named in the indictment, but they were described as potential witnesses or subjects of ongoing investigation. The publication of the indictment had an immediate and devastating impact on Sean's remaining business relationships. The detailed allegations contained in the document made it impossible for any legitimate business to continue its association with Sean or his companies. Within hours of the indictment's release, several major brands announced that they were terminating their relationships with Sean's organization. The indictment also had a significant impact on Sean's family and personal relationships. The document's detailed allegations about his abusive behavior created a public record that would affect his relationships with his children, former partners, and other family members. The indictment had effectively destroyed not just his business empire, but also his personal life and reputation. The legal implications of the indictment were immediate and far-reaching. The document provided a roadmap for the prosecution's case against Sean, outlining the evidence that would be presented at trial and the legal theories that would be used to secure his conviction. The indictment also made it clear that Sean faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison if convicted on all charges. The indictment represented a watershed moment in the entertainment industry's reckoning with abusive behavior. The detailed allegations against Sean demonstrated that wealth and celebrity status could not protect individuals from the consequences of their criminal actions. The indictment also highlighted the importance of federal law enforcement in addressing crimes that were too complex or sophisticated for local authorities to handle effectively. The document would serve as the foundation for the federal case against Sean, providing prosecutors with the legal framework necessary to present their evidence and secure his conviction. The indictment had effectively ended Sean's career and destroyed his reputation, but it had also provided a measure of justice for the victims who had suffered under his abuse for so many years. The arrest, the fall of a titan. The arrest of Sean Combs on September 16, 2024, marked the end of one of the most spectacular rises and falls in American entertainment history. At 8:15 p.m., federal agents took Sean into custody at the Park Hyatt Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, where he had been staying since the raids on his property 6 months earlier. The arrest was conducted quietly and professionally, but its implications would reverberate throughout the entertainment industry and beyond. The decision to arrest Sean had been made after months of careful consideration by federal prosecutors. The evidence gathered during the investigation was overwhelming, and the grand jury had returned an indictment that outlined serious federal crimes. But the timing of the arrest was also strategic, designed to prevent Sean from fleeing the country or destroying additional evidence. Sean's behavior in the months leading up to his arrest had been increasingly erratic and desperate. He had made several attempts to travel internationally, ostensibly for business purposes, but federal authorities had been monitoring his movements and had intervened to prevent him from leaving the country. The restriction on his travel had been a source of significant frustration for Sean, who had grown accustomed to moving freely around the world. The arrest itself was conducted with military precision. Federal agents had been surveilling Sean's location for several days, and they had coordinated with hotel security to ensure that the arrest could be conducted safely and discreetly. The agents were prepared for the possibility that Sean might resist or attempt to flee, but he surrendered without incident. The moment of Sean's arrest was captured by surveillance cameras in the hotel lobby, and the footage would later become a powerful symbol of his fall from grace. The images showed Sean, once one of the most powerful figures in entertainment, being led away in handcuffs by federal agents. The contrast between his current situation and his former status as a billionaire mogul was stark and dramatic. The immediate aftermath of the arrest was chaotic and intense. News of Sean's arrest spread rapidly through social media and traditional news outlets, generating widespread coverage and commentary. The entertainment industry was shocked by the arrest, despite the months of speculation and investigation that had preceded it. Sean's family and associates were devastated by the arrest. His children, who had largely been shielded from the details of the federal investigation, were forced to confront the reality of their father's alleged crimes. His business partners and employees were left to deal with the fallout from the arrest and the collapse of his business empire. The legal proceedings that followed Sean's arrest were swift and decisive. He was transported to federal court in Manhattan, where he appeared before a magistrate judge for his initial appearance. The charges against him were read aloud, and he was informed of his rights and the potential penalties he faced. The prosecution's request to hold Sean without bail was one of the most significant aspects of the initial court proceedings. Federal prosecutors argued that Sean posed a flight risk and a danger to the community, and they presented evidence of his wealth, international connections, and history of attempting to intimidate witnesses. The prosecution's argument was compelling and well documented. Sean's defense team, led by prominent criminal defense attorney Mark Agnifilo, argued for his release on bail. They proposed a bail package that included $50 million in assets, house arrest, and electronic monitoring. The defense argued that Sean was not a flight risk and that he was committed to fighting the charges against him. The magistrate judge's decision to deny bail was a significant victory for the prosecution. The judge found that Sean posed both a flight risk and a danger to the community, and that no conditions of release could adequately address these concerns. The denial of bail meant that Sean would remain in federal custody throughout the duration of his case. The transfer of Sean to the Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, in Brooklyn was a symbolic moment that represented the complete collapse of his former life. The MDC was a federal facility that housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and Sean's placement there was a stark reminder of the severity of the charges against him. The conditions at the MDC were a dramatic change from the luxury to which Sean had become accustomed. The facility was overcrowded, understaffed, and plagued by problems with heating, lighting, and sanitation. For a man who had lived in multi-million-dollar mansions and traveled in private jets, the conditions at the MDC represented a profound fall from grace. Sean's adjustment to life in federal custody was difficult and traumatic. He was placed in protective custody due to his high profile and the nature of his alleged crimes, which meant that he was isolated from other inmates for most of the day. The isolation was necessary for his safety, but it also added to the psychological pressure he was experiencing. The impact of Sean's arrest on his business empire was immediate and devastating. Within hours of his arrest, major corporate partners began terminating their relationships with his companies. The arrest had made it impossible for any legitimate business to continue its association with Sean or his organization. The collapse of Sean's business empire was swift and comprehensive. Companies that had taken decades to build were effectively destroyed within days of his arrest. The employees of these companies, many of whom had worked for Sean for years, were left without jobs and uncertain about their futures. The arrest also had significant implications for Sean's alleged victims. For many women who had been abused by Sean, his arrest represented a validation of their experiences and a hope that justice might finally be possible. The arrest encouraged additional victims to come forward, providing prosecutors with even more evidence of Sean's criminal behavior. The media coverage of Sean's arrest was intense and widespread. The story dominated news cycles for days, with extensive coverage of the charges against him and the evidence that had been gathered by federal investigators. The coverage was generally critical of Sean, reflecting the serious nature of the allegations against him. The arrest also sparked broader conversations about abuse and exploitation in the entertainment industry. Sean's case highlighted the ways in which wealth and celebrity status could be used to conceal criminal behavior, and it raised questions about the industry's responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from predatory behavior. The legal implications of Sean's arrest were significant and far-reaching. The arrest had effectively ended his career and destroyed his reputation, but it had also set in motion the legal process that would ultimately determine his fate. The charges against him were serious, and the evidence appeared to be strong. The arrest represented a victory for the federal investigators and prosecutors who had worked tirelessly to build the case against Sean. The investigation had been complex and challenging, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions, but the arrest demonstrated that the federal government was committed to holding Sean accountable for his alleged crimes. The arrest also represented a victory for Sean's alleged victims, who had shown tremendous courage in coming forward with their stories. Their testimony had been crucial to the success of the federal investigation, and their willingness to speak out had made it possible to hold Sean accountable for his actions. The arrest of Sean Combs marked the end of an era in the entertainment industry. His fall from grace was complete and irreversible, and his arrest served as a powerful reminder that wealth and celebrity status could not protect individuals from the consequences of their criminal actions. The titan who had once seemed untouchable had finally been brought to justice. The trial. Justice under the microscope. The trial of Sean Combs began on May 12, 2025 in the ceremonial courtroom of the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan. The venue was chosen not just for its capacity to accommodate the massive media attention, but for its symbolic significance as the site where some of the most important criminal cases in American history had been decided. The irony was not lost on observers that a man who had once been celebrated as a cultural icon was now standing trial in a courthouse named after a civil rights legend. The selection of the jury had taken 3 weeks, reflecting the extraordinary challenge of finding 12 individuals who could fairly evaluate the evidence against one of the most famous figures in American popular culture. The prosecution and defense had questioned over 300 potential jurors, exploring their knowledge of Sean's career, their opinions about the entertainment industry, and their ability to render a verdict based solely on the evidence presented at trial. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67. The composition was notable for its diversity, reflecting the demographics of New York City and the broad impact of Sean's alleged crimes. The jurors included a retired teacher, a social worker, an accountant, a nurse, a construction worker, and several other professionals who had no direct connection to the entertainment industry. The opening statement set the tone for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in recent history. Assistant United States Attorney Emily Johnson, the lead prosecutor, delivered a methodical and devastating presentation that outlined the government's case against Sean. She described him not as a successful entrepreneur, but as the leader of a criminal enterprise that had systematically abused and exploited vulnerable women for over 2 decades. This is not a case about a successful businessman who made some poor personal choices, Johnson told the jury. This is a case about a predator who used his wealth, his influence, and his celebrity status to create a system of abuse that destroyed the lives of countless women. The prosecution's opening statement was supported by a multimedia presentation that included photographs, video footage, and audio recordings that provided a glimpse into the evidence that would be presented during the trial. The presentation was professional and restrained, but its impact on the jury was evident from their expressions and body language. The defense's opening statement was delivered by Mark Agnifilo, Sean's lead attorney, who attempted to reframe the case as a prosecution of a successful black entrepreneur who had been targeted by a criminal justice system that was biased against wealthy African Americans. Agnifilo argued that Sean's sexual behavior, while unconventional, was consensual and that the government's case was based on the testimony of disgruntled former employees and opportunistic women seeking financial gain. Sean Combs is not a perfect man, Agnifilo acknowledged. He has lived his life in the public eye and he has made mistakes. But the government wants you to believe that his success, his wealth, and his lifestyle are evidence of criminal behavior. The defense's strategy was risky but potentially effective. By casting Sean as a victim of prosecutorial overreach and racial bias, Agnifilo was attempting to shift the focus from the evidence of his crimes to the broader societal issues that might resonate with some jurors. The strategy required the defense to acknowledge Sean's unconventional behavior while arguing that it was not criminal. The prosecution's case was built around the testimony of 34 witnesses, including 12 alleged victims who described their experiences with Sean in detail. The testimony was often emotional and difficult to hear, as the women described years of abuse, manipulation, and exploitation. The prosecution had carefully prepared the witnesses, recognizing that their credibility would be crucial to the success of the case. The first witness was Cassie Ventura, whose lawsuit had initiated the federal investigation. Cassie's testimony was compelling and detailed, describing the decade-long relationship that had begun when she was 19 years old and Sean was 36. She described the gradual escalation of Sean's controlling behavior, the introduction of drugs and alcohol, and the systematic abuse that had defined their relationship. Cassie's testimony was supported by physical evidence, including medical records that documented injuries she had sustained, financial records that showed payments Sean had made to her, and recordings that captured some of their conversations. The evidence corroborated her testimony and provided objective support for her allegations. The prosecution also presented testimony from former employees of Sean's various companies, who described the workplace culture and the activities they had witnessed. The employees described an environment where normal boundaries were routinely violated, where employees were required to facilitate Sean's personal activities, and where dissent or resistance was not tolerated. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution presented the hotel surveillance footage from 2016 that showed Sean assaulting Cassie in the hallway of the Intercontinental Hotel. The video was played multiple times, and its impact on the jury was evident. The footage provided irrefutable evidence of Sean's violent behavior and corroborated Cassie's testimony about the abuse she had suffered. The prosecution also presented extensive financial evidence that showed the scope of Sean's criminal enterprise. The evidence included records of payments to victims, expenses for freak-off activities, and the complex financial structures that Sean had used to conceal his crimes. The financial evidence demonstrated that Sean's criminal activities had been systematic and well-organized, not impulsive or isolated incidents. The defense's case was more limited in scope, focusing on challenging the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses and presenting an alternative narrative of Sean's behavior. The defense called 12 witnesses, including character witnesses who testified about Sean's charitable activities and business accomplishments. The defense also presented expert testimony about the dynamics of consensual adult relationships, arguing that the sexual activities described by the prosecution's witnesses were not inherently criminal. The defense's experts attempted to distinguish between unconventional but consensual behavior and criminal activity. The most significant aspect of the defense's strategy was its decision not to call Sean as a witness. The decision was strategically sound, as it protected Sean from cross-examination by the prosecution, but it also meant that the jury would not hear directly from him about the allegations against him. The cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses was aggressive and thorough. The defense attorneys attempted to highlight inconsistencies in the witnesses' testimony, to suggest that they had financial motivations for their allegations, and to argue that their relationships with Sean had been voluntary and consensual. The defense's cross-examination of Cassie was particularly intense, as the attorneys attempted to undermine her credibility by highlighting her continued relationship with Sean, even after alleged incidents of abuse. The defense argued that her behavior was inconsistent with someone who was truly being abused and that her allegations were motivated by financial gain. The prosecution's rebuttal was strong and effective. The prosecutors presented additional evidence that corroborated the testimony of their witnesses, including expert testimony about the dynamics of abusive relationships and the reasons why victims often remain in contact with their abusers. The closing arguments were passionate and compelling presentations from both sides. The prosecution argued that the evidence clearly demonstrated Sean's guilt on all charges, while the defense argued that the government had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching its verdict. The deliberation period was tense and closely watched, as observers speculated about the jury's thinking and the likelihood of conviction. The length of the deliberation suggested that the jury was carefully considering the evidence and the competing arguments presented by both sides. The verdict, when it came, was a mixed result that reflected the complexity of the case and the strength of the evidence on different charges. The jury found Sean not guilty on the most serious charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking, but guilty on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. The verdict was a partial victory for both sides. The prosecution had succeeded in securing convictions on serious federal charges that carried significant penalties, but they had failed to prove the most serious allegations against Sean. The defense had succeeded in avoiding the most serious charges, but they had not achieved the complete acquittal that they had hoped for. The verdict was also a reflection of the jury's careful consideration of the evidence and their determination to convict Sean only on charges that were supported by clear and convincing evidence. The jury's decision to acquit Sean on the racketeering and sex trafficking charges suggested that they had not been convinced that his behavior constituted a criminal enterprise, but they had been convinced that he had engaged in specific criminal acts. The trial had lasted 7 weeks and had generated extensive media coverage and public interest. The verdict was seen as a significant development in the entertainment industry's reckoning with abusive behavior, and it was expected to have lasting implications for how such cases would be prosecuted in the future. The trial had also been a personal ordeal for Sean, who had been forced to sit in court for weeks while the most intimate and damaging details of his life were discussed in public. The trial had effectively ended his career and destroyed his reputation, regardless of the specific charges on which he was convicted. The verdict represented a measure of justice for Sean's alleged victims, who had shown tremendous courage in coming forward with their stories. While the jury had not convicted Sean on all charges, the convictions that were secured represented a validation of their experiences and a recognition that Sean's behavior had been criminal. The trial had also highlighted important issues about power, wealth, and accountability in American society. The case had demonstrated that even the most powerful and wealthy individuals could be held accountable for their actions, but it had also shown the challenges of prosecuting such cases and the importance of victims' courage in coming forward. The mixed verdict would set the stage for the sentencing phase of the case, where Sean would face the possibility of significant prison time for his convictions. The sentencing would be the final chapter in the legal saga that had brought down one of the most powerful figures in American entertainment. The collapse. When empires fall. The conviction of Sean Combs on federal charges marked not just the end of a legal proceeding, but the complete disintegration of a business empire that had taken 3 decades to build. The collapse was swift, comprehensive, and irreversible, affecting not only Sean's personal fortune but also the lives of hundreds of employees, business partners, and associates who had been connected to his organization. The immediate aftermath of the verdict was a cascade of corporate departures that began within hours of the jury's decision. Diageo, the multinational beverage company that had paid Sean over $1 billion for his partnership with Ciroc Vodka, announced the termination of their relationship in a terse statement that cited moral clauses in their contract. The termination was particularly devastating because the Ciroc partnership had been the financial foundation of Sean's empire, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The fashion industry's response was equally swift and decisive. Macy's, which had been the primary retail partner for Sean John clothing, announced that it would discontinue the brand immediately. The decision affected not only Sean's financial interests, but also the thousands of retail workers who had been employed in selling and marketing the brand. Within days, Sean John merchandise was being marked down and removed from stores across the country. The media industry's reaction was particularly significant, given Sean's efforts to establish himself as a major player in that sector. Revolt TV, the cable network that Sean had founded and positioned as a voice for hip-hop culture, was abandoned by its major advertisers and cable carriers. The network had employed hundreds of people and had been seen as an important platform for emerging artists and media personalities. The collapse of Sean's businesses had a devastating impact on the hundreds of employees who had worked for his various companies. Many of these employees had been with Sean's organization for years, and they had developed specialized skills and expertise that were specific to his businesses. The sudden closure of these companies left them without jobs and facing uncertain futures in an industry that was now aware of their association with Sean's criminal activities. The financial impact of the collapse was staggering. Sean's net worth, which had been estimated at $1 billion just 2 years earlier, had effectively been reduced to zero. The assets that remained were either frozen by federal authorities as part of the criminal case, or were being liquidated to pay legal fees and other expenses. The man who had once been listed among the wealthiest figures in entertainment was now facing the possibility of financial ruin. The real estate portfolio that had been a symbol of Sean's success was quickly liquidated. The $40 million mansion in Los Angeles was sold at a significant loss, with the buyer reportedly paying only $28 million for the property. The Miami mansion, which had been damaged during the federal raids, was sold for even less than its assessed value. The New York penthouse, which had been Sean's primary residence, was foreclosed upon when he was unable to make mortgage payments from federal custody. The impact on Sean's family was particularly tragic. His children, who had been raised in luxury and privilege, were forced to confront not only the reality of their father's crimes, but also the loss of the lifestyle they had known. The family's financial situation was complicated by the fact that many of their assets had been purchased with money that was now subject to federal forfeiture proceedings. The collapse of Sean's empire also had broader implications for the entertainment industry. The revelations about his criminal activities had called into question the industry's tolerance for abusive behavior, and had sparked conversations about the need for greater accountability and oversight. Several major entertainment companies announced new policies and procedures designed to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. The music industry's response was particularly significant. Bad Boy Records, which had been one of the most successful hip-hop labels in history, was effectively dissolved. The label's catalog of recordings, which included some of the most important hip-hop albums of the 1990s and 2000s, was sold to pay creditors and legal fees. The sale marked the end of an era in hip-hop history and the loss of a cultural legacy that had been built over decades. The impact on the artists who had been associated with Bad Boy Records was complex and varied. Some artists, particularly those who had achieved independent success, were able to distance themselves from Sean's legacy and continue their careers. Others, particularly those who were still under contract to Bad Boy, faced uncertainty about their futures and the ownership of their recordings. The charitable organizations that had been supported by Sean's foundation also faced significant challenges. The Sean Combs Foundation, which had provided educational opportunities and other services to underserved communities, was forced to cease operations due to the loss of funding and the reputational damage associated with Sean's criminal convictions. The closure of the foundation affected thousands of students and community members who had benefited from its programs. The collapse of Sean's empire also had implications for the broader hip-hop community. Sean had been seen as a pioneer and role model for other entrepreneurs in the genre, and his fall from grace raised questions about the sustainability of the business models that had been developed around hip-hop culture. The scandal also highlighted the need for greater transparency and accountability in the business practices of entertainment industry executives. The international implications of the collapse were also significant. Sean's businesses had operated in multiple countries, and his criminal activities had affected victims and associates around the world. The collapse of his empire had economic implications for the international partners and employees who had been associated with his organization. The speed of the collapse was particularly remarkable, given the size and scope of Sean's business empire. The organization that had taken 3 decades to build was effectively destroyed within months of his conviction. The collapse demonstrated the fragility of business empires that are built around the personal brand and reputation of a single individual. The legal implications of the collapse were also complex and far-reaching. The federal government's seizure of Sean's assets as part of the criminal case had created a complicated web of legal proceedings that would take years to resolve. The victims of Sean's crimes were seeking compensation through civil lawsuits, and the creditors of his businesses were seeking payment through bankruptcy proceedings. The collapse of Sean's empire represented one of the most dramatic falls from grace in American business history. The man who had once been celebrated as a visionary entrepreneur and cultural icon had been revealed as a criminal whose success had been built on the systematic exploitation and abuse of vulnerable individuals. The psychological impact of the collapse on Sean himself was profound and devastating. For a man who had defined himself through his wealth, power, and influence, the loss of everything he had built represented a complete destruction of his identity. The reports from federal prisons suggested that Sean was struggling to cope with the reality of his situation and the magnitude of his fall from grace. The collapse also served as a cautionary tale for other powerful figures in the entertainment industry. The speed and completeness of Sean's downfall demonstrated that wealth and influence could not ultimately protect individuals from the consequences of their criminal actions. The case had shown that the federal government was willing and able to investigate and prosecute even the most powerful figures in American society. The victims of Sean's crimes found some measure of satisfaction in the collapse of his empire, though many acknowledged that no amount of financial loss could compensate for the trauma and suffering they had endured. The collapse represented a form of justice that went beyond the criminal convictions, as it demonstrated that Sean's crimes had real and lasting consequences. The collapse of Sean's empire also had broader implications for American society and culture. The case had highlighted the ways in which wealth and power could be used to conceal and facilitate criminal behavior, and it had sparked conversations about the need for greater accountability and oversight in all sectors of society. The entertainment industry's response to the collapse was mixed and complex. While many industry figures condemned Sean's behavior and expressed support for his victims, there were also concerns about the potential impact on the industry's reputation and business practices. The case had demonstrated that the entertainment industry was vulnerable to the same types of criminal behavior that affected other sectors of society. The collapse of Sean's empire would have lasting implications for the hip-hop community and the broader entertainment industry. The case had shown that success and influence could not excuse criminal behavior, and it had demonstrated the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions. The collapse would serve as a reminder that true success must be built on ethical foundations, and that the exploitation of others would ultimately lead to destruction. Ari, the victims' voices. Courage in the face of power. The true measure of Sean Combs's crimes was not found in the financial scope of his empire or the legal intricacies of his prosecution, but in the lived experiences of the women who suffered under his systematic abuse. Their stories, many of which emerged only after his conviction, revealed the human cost of his criminal enterprise and the extraordinary courage required to challenge one of the most powerful figures in American entertainment. The process of coming forward was traumatic and dangerous for Sean's victims. Many had been isolated from friends and family, threatened with career destruction, and bound by non-disclosure agreements that carried severe financial penalties. The women who eventually testified against Sean had to overcome not only their own trauma, but also the institutional barriers that had been constructed to protect him from accountability. Jessica Martinez, a former aspiring model who had been recruited into Sean's orbit in 2018, described the psychological manipulation that had made it difficult for her to recognize the abuse she was experiencing. "He was so charming at first," she recalled during her testimony. "He made me feel like I was special, like I was chosen for something important." Martinez's experience was typical of many victims. Sean had used his wealth and influence to create an environment where normal social boundaries were eroded gradually. The women were often recruited through legitimate channels, modeling agencies, talent scouts, or business contacts, and were initially offered opportunities that seemed legitimate and appealing. The grooming process was sophisticated and psychologically manipulative. Sean would begin by offering small favors or opportunities, gradually building trust and dependency. He would then slowly escalate his demands, using a combination of rewards and punishments to condition the women to comply with his requests. He would make you feel like you owed him everything, recalled another victim, who requested anonymity. He would remind you constantly of the opportunities he had given you, the money he had spent on you, the doors he had opened for you. The financial control was a central component of Sean's abuse. He would provide victims with money, gifts, and opportunities that created a sense of obligation and dependency. The women were often isolated from their previous sources of income and support, making them entirely dependent on Sean's generosity. Many victims described being given credit cards, expensive gifts, and access to luxury experiences that were contingent on their continued compliance with Sean's demands. The lifestyle was seductive and addictive, but it came with a price that many victims didn't fully understand until it was too late. The introduction of drugs and alcohol was another common element in the victims' experiences. The drugs were often presented as party favors or gifts, but they were actually tools for facilitating abuse and ensuring compliance. Several victims described being pressured to use drugs or alcohol before participating in sexual activities. The substances were used to impair their judgment and reduce their ability to resist or remember what was happening to them. Some victims reported being given drugs without their knowledge or consent, waking up with no memory of what had occurred. The sexual abuse itself was systematic and degrading. Victims described being forced to participate in elaborate sexual performances that were recorded and sometimes broadcast to paying customers. The activities were often painful and humiliating, designed to demonstrate Sean's power and control over the women. He would make you do things that you never thought you would do, recalled one victim, and then he would record it and use those recordings to control you even more. The recording of sexual activities was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Sean's abuse. The recordings served multiple purposes. They provided Sean with entertainment, they could be used to blackmail victims into continued compliance, and they could be sold or distributed to generate additional revenue. Many victims described the psychological impact of knowing that their abuse had been recorded and potentially distributed. The recordings created a sense of permanent vulnerability and shame that made it difficult for victims to seek help or report the abuse. The isolation of victims was another key component of Sean's system of abuse. He would systematically separate women from their friends and family, creating an environment where they were dependent on him for social contact and emotional support. The isolation made it difficult for victims to maintain perspective on their situation or to seek help from outside sources. He would find ways to turn you against your friends and family, recalled one victim. He would tell you that they were jealous of your success, that they didn't understand what you were going through, that they were trying to hold you back. The threats and intimidation were constant and varied. Sean would threaten victims with physical violence, legal action, and career destruction if they attempted to leave or report his behavior. The threats were often backed up by demonstrations of his power and influence, making it clear that he had the resources to follow through on his promises. Several victims described being threatened with violence not only against themselves, but also against their family members. The threats created a climate of fear that made it difficult for victims to seek help or to consider leaving Sean's organization. The impact of Sean's abuse on his victims was profound and lasting. Many developed substance abuse problems, mental health issues, and other problems that would affect them for years. The trauma of their experiences was compounded by the isolation, shame, and fear that Sean had deliberately cultivated. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who worked with several of Sean's victims, described the unique challenges they faced in recovering from their experiences. These women were subjected to a form of systematic psychological torture that was designed to break down their sense of self and their ability to resist, she explained. The decision to come forward and testify against Sean required extraordinary courage from his victims. They faced the prospect of public scrutiny, legal retaliation, and the exposure of intimate details of their abuse. Many had to overcome years of conditioning that had taught them to blame themselves for their experiences. I knew that if I came forward, my life would never be the same, recalled one victim. But I also knew that if I didn't speak up, he would continue to hurt other women. The support system that developed among Sean's victims was crucial to their ability to come forward. As more women began to share their experiences, they realized that they were not alone, and that their individual experiences were part of a larger pattern of abuse. The solidarity among victims provided them with the strength and courage necessary to challenge Sean's power. The civil lawsuits that were filed against Sean provided victims with a legal mechanism for seeking justice and compensation. The lawsuits also served as a means of publicly documenting the abuse and ensuring that Sean's crimes would not be forgotten or minimized. The impact of the victims' courage extended far beyond Sean's individual case. Their willingness to come forward had encouraged other victims of powerful abusers to speak out, and it had contributed to broader conversations about accountability and justice in cases involving wealthy and influential defendants. The testimony of Sean's victims was central to the success of the federal prosecution. Their courage in coming forward and their willingness to relive their trauma in court provided prosecutors with the evidence necessary to secure convictions. Without their testimony, Sean would likely have escaped accountability for his crimes. The victims' stories also served as a powerful reminder of the human cost of Sean's criminal enterprise. Behind the financial records, legal documents, and business dealings were real people whose lives had been shattered by his abuse. Their courage in coming forward ensured that their experiences would not be forgotten and that their suffering would not be in vain. The ongoing recovery process for Sean's victims would be long and difficult. Many would require years of therapy and support to overcome the trauma of their experiences. But their courage in coming forward had already achieved something significant. They had brought down one of the most powerful and dangerous predators in American entertainment, and they had sent a message that no one, regardless of their wealth or influence, was above the law. The sentencing. Justice delayed but not denied. The sentencing hearing for Sean Combs was scheduled for October 3, 2025, in the same courthouse where his trial had taken place. The date had been circled on calendars throughout the entertainment industry, the legal community, and by the victims who had waited so long to see justice served. The hearing would represent the final chapter in a legal saga that had captivated the nation and fundamentally altered the landscape of accountability in American entertainment. The weeks leading up to the sentencing had been marked by intensive legal maneuvering from both sides. The prosecution had filed a comprehensive sentencing memorandum that outlined the scope of Sean's crimes and argued for a sentence that would reflect the severity of his conduct and serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar behavior. The defense had responded with their own memorandum that emphasized Sean's charitable work, his contributions to the entertainment industry, and his potential for rehabilitation. The prosecution's sentencing memorandum was a damning document that painted a picture of systematic abuse and exploitation spanning more than 2 decades. The prosecutors argued that Sean had used his wealth and influence to create a criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of women, and that his crimes had been characterized by a level of sophistication and callousness that warranted significant punishment. The defendant has shown a complete disregard for the rights and dignity of his victims, the prosecutors wrote. His crimes were not impulsive acts of passion, but calculated and systematic abuse that was designed to satisfy his own twisted desires while enriching himself financially. The prosecution's memorandum included victim impact statements from 12 of Sean's victims, each describing the lasting impact of his abuse on their lives. The statements were powerful and emotional, detailing the psychological trauma, financial hardship, and personal destruction that had resulted from their experiences with Sean. Cassie Ventura's victim impact statement was particularly moving. She described the decade-long relationship that had begun when she was a teenager and had evolved into a nightmare of abuse and control. "He stole my youth, my innocence, and my sense of self," she wrote. "The person I was before I met him no longer exists." The defense's sentencing memorandum took a markedly different approach. acknowledging Sean's crimes while arguing for a sentence that would allow him to eventually rebuild his life and continue his contributions to society. The defense emphasized his charitable work, his role as a father to 6 children, and his potential for rehabilitation. Mr. Combs accepts responsibility for his actions and is committed to making amends for the harm he has caused. The defense wrote, "He is not the monster that the prosecution has portrayed him to be, but a flawed human being who lost his way and made terrible choices." The defense's memorandum included letters of support from Sean's family members, friends, and colleagues who testified to his positive qualities and his potential for rehabilitation. The letters painted a picture of a man who had been a generous friend, a devoted father, and a committed philanthropist, even as he had engaged in criminal behavior. The sentencing hearing itself was conducted in a packed courtroom that included Sean's victims, family members, media representatives, and members of the public who had followed the case closely. The atmosphere was tense and emotional, with many observers recognizing that the hearing would represent a historic moment in the entertainment industry's reckoning with abusive behavior. Judge Aaron Subramanian, who had presided over the trial, began the hearing by acknowledging the significance of the case and the impact it had had on the victims, Sean's family, and the broader entertainment industry. He noted that the case had raised important questions about power, accountability, and justice that extended far beyond the specific crimes for which Sean had been convicted. The hearing began with statements from several of Sean's victims, who had chosen to appear in person to describe the impact of his crimes on their lives. The statements were powerful and emotional, with many of the women describing years of therapy, financial hardship, and personal struggle that had resulted from their experiences with Sean. "I want him to know that he didn't break me," said one victim, speaking directly to Sean. "He tried to destroy my life, but I survived." Sean's response to the victim statements was closely watched by observers in the courtroom. He appeared to be listening intently, occasionally wiping away tears, but he did not speak or react visibly to the specific allegations and descriptions of his behavior. The prosecution's argument for sentencing was delivered by Assistant United States Attorney Emily Johnson, who had led the government's case throughout the trial. Johnson argued that Sean's crimes warranted a sentence of 4 to 5 years in federal prison, emphasizing the systematic nature of his abuse and the harm he had caused to his victims. "This case is about more than just the specific crimes for which the defendant has been convicted," Johnson argued. "This is about a pattern of behavior that spans decades and has caused immeasurable harm to dozens of women." The defense's argument was delivered by Mark Agnifilo, who had represented Sean throughout the legal proceedings. Agnifilo argued for a sentence of 2 to 3 years, emphasizing Sean's acceptance of responsibility, his potential for rehabilitation, and the impact that a lengthy sentence would have on his 6 children. "Mr. Combs is not asking for mercy," Agnifilo argued. "He is asking for justice. He has accepted responsibility for his actions, and he is committed to making amends for the harm he has caused." The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when Sean was given the opportunity to address the court. His statement was brief but appeared to be sincere as he expressed remorse for his actions and acknowledged the harm he had caused to his victims. "I stand before you today a humbled and broken man," Sean said, his voice barely audible in the quiet courtroom. "I have caused immeasurable pain to people who trusted me, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for my actions." Judge Subramanian's sentencing decision was thoughtful and comprehensive, reflecting his careful consideration of the evidence, the arguments presented by both sides, and the broader implications of the case. He sentenced Sean to 4 years in federal prison, a sentence that fell within the prosecution's recommendation, but also acknowledged the defense's arguments about Sean's potential for rehabilitation. "This case represents one of the most serious examples of abuse of power that I have encountered in my career," Judge Subramanian said. "The defendant used his wealth, influence, and celebrity status to systematically abuse and exploit vulnerable women over a period of more than 2 decades. $5 million in restitution to his victims, to undergo psychological counseling, and to perform 500 hours of community service focused on preventing domestic violence and abuse. The additional conditions were designed to ensure that Sean would continue to be held accountable for his actions even after his release from prison. The reaction to the sentencing was mixed and reflected the complex emotions surrounding the case. Many of Sean's victims expressed satisfaction that he had been held accountable for his crimes, while also acknowledging that no sentence could fully compensate for the trauma they had endured. "I'm glad that he's finally being held accountable," said one victim. "It won't undo what happened to me, but it might prevent it from happening to someone else." Sean's family members and supporters expressed disappointment with the sentence, arguing that it was too harsh given his acceptance of responsibility and his potential for rehabilitation. They vowed to continue supporting him through his incarceration and his eventual reintegration into society. The entertainment industry's response to the sentencing was generally positive, with many industry figures expressing support for the victims and acknowledging the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions. The case had sparked broader conversations about the need for systemic changes in the industry to prevent similar abuse from occurring in the future. The legal implications of the sentencing were significant and far-reaching. The case had established important precedents for how cases involving wealthy and influential defendants would be prosecuted and sentenced. It had also demonstrated the importance of victim testimony in securing convictions and appropriate sentences. The sentencing represented the end of Sean's legal battles related to the federal criminal charges, but it did not mark the end of his legal troubles. He continued to face dozens of civil lawsuits from victims seeking financial compensation for their suffering. The civil cases would likely continue for years and could result in additional financial penalties. The psychological impact of the sentencing on Sean was expected to be significant. The man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in American entertainment was now facing years in federal prison, stripped of his wealth, influence, and reputation. The adjustment to prison life would be difficult and potentially dangerous, given his high profile and the nature of his crimes. The sentencing also had broader implications for American society and culture. The case had highlighted the ways in which wealth and power could be used to conceal and facilitate criminal behavior, and it had demonstrated the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions regardless of their status or influence. The victims of Sean's crimes found some measure of closure in the sentencing, though many acknowledged that their recovery would be an ongoing process. The courage they had shown in coming forward had not only brought their abuser to justice, but had also encouraged other victims of powerful predators to speak out. The sentencing of Sean Combs represented a historic moment in the entertainment industry's reckoning with abusive behavior. It demonstrated that wealth and celebrity status could not protect individuals from the consequences of their criminal actions, and it sent a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. The case would serve as a precedent for future prosecutions, and as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately be served. Epilogue: The Reckoning and its Aftermath. As Sean Combs began serving his 4-year sentence at FCI Otisville, a medium-security federal prison in upstate New York, the full scope of his fall from grace continued to reverberate throughout American culture. The man who had once commanded billion-dollar business deals from his Manhattan penthouse was now confined to a 6-by-8-foot cell, his daily routine governed by federal prison regulations rather than his own imperial whims. The transformation was stark and irreversible. Reports from prison officials and fellow inmates described a man struggling to adapt to a reality where his former wealth and influence meant nothing. The commissary privileges that allowed him to purchase basic necessities were funded by a modest account established by his family, a far cry from the unlimited resources he had once commanded. The impact of Sean's conviction extended far beyond his personal circumstances. The entertainment industry had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture of impunity that had allowed his crimes to continue for so long. Major record labels, talent agencies, and media companies had implemented new policies and procedures designed to prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. The changes were significant and far-reaching. Many companies had established independent reporting mechanisms for allegations of abuse, created training programs for employees and artists, and implemented stronger due diligence procedures for business partnerships. The industry had also begun to take more seriously the non-disclosure agreements that had been used to silence victims, with several major companies announcing policies limiting their use. The cultural impact of the case was equally profound. The term freak-off had entered the popular lexicon as a symbol of the abuse of power and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The case had sparked broader conversations about consent, power dynamics, and the responsibility of institutions to protect those who were vulnerable to abuse. The hip-hop community had been particularly affected by Sean's fall from grace. He had been seen as a pioneer and role model for other entrepreneurs in the genre, and his conviction had forced the community to confront difficult questions about the relationship between success and ethics. Several prominent hip hop artists had spoken out about the need for the community to do better in protecting vulnerable individuals and holding powerful figures accountable. The victims of Sean's crimes had begun the long process of rebuilding their lives, supported by the financial settlements from civil lawsuits and the therapeutic resources that had been made available to them. Many had become advocates for other victims of abuse, using their experiences to educate others about the warning signs of predatory behavior and the importance of seeking help. Cassie Ventura, who had shown extraordinary courage in coming forward with her allegations, had become a prominent advocate for victims' rights. She had established a foundation that provided support and resources to victims of domestic violence and abuse, and she had become a sought-after speaker on the topic of survival and recovery. "I want my experience to mean something," Cassie had said in a recent interview. "I want other women to know that they're not alone, that they can survive, and that there are people who will believe them and support them." The legal precedents established by Sean's case had already begun to influence other prosecutions. Federal prosecutors around the country were using the case as a model for how to investigate and prosecute complex cases involving wealthy and influential defendants. The case had demonstrated the importance of victim testimony, the value of financial evidence, and the effectiveness of federal RICO statutes in addressing systematic criminal behavior. The business empire that Sean had built over 3 decades had been completely dismantled. Bad Boy Records, which had been one of the most successful hip-hop labels in history, had been sold to pay creditors and legal fees. The catalog of recordings, which included some of the most important hip-hop albums of the 1990s and 2000s, was now owned by a major record label conglomerate. The Sean John clothing brand, which had once been a symbol of hip-hop's mainstream success, had been discontinued. The brand's inventory had been liquidated, and its intellectual property had been sold to a company that specialized in managing distressed assets. The brand that had once generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue was now a footnote in fashion history. The Ciroc vodka partnership, which had been the financial foundation of Sean's empire, had been terminated immediately after his conviction. Diageo had moved quickly to distance itself from Sean's reputation, launching a new marketing campaign that emphasized the brand's independence from its former partner. The partnership that had generated over $1 billion in revenue was now a cautionary tale about the risks of celebrity endorsements. The real estate portfolio that had been a symbol of Sean's success had been liquidated to pay legal fees and victim settlements. The mansions in Los Angeles, Miami, and New York that had once hosted his criminal activities had been sold to new owners who had no connection to his legacy. The properties had been thoroughly renovated to remove any traces of their former use. The impact on Sean's family had been profound and lasting. His 6 children, who had been raised in luxury and privilege, had been forced to confront the reality of their father's crimes and the collapse of their family's fortune. The older children had changed their names and sought to distance themselves from their father's legacy, while the younger children were receiving therapy and support to help them process their experiences. Kim Porter, who had been Sean's longtime partner and the mother of 3 of his children, had died in 2018 before the full scope of his crimes had been revealed. Her death had been ruled as resulting from natural causes, but some observers had speculated about the stress and trauma that her relationship with Sean might have contributed to her health problems. The entertainment industry had also been forced to confront the role that media coverage had played in enabling Sean's crimes. For decades, entertainment journalists had written about rumors and allegations surrounding Sean's behavior, but they had rarely pursued detailed investigations or given prominence to his victims' stories. The case had sparked conversations about the responsibility of media outlets to investigate and report on allegations of abuse by powerful figures. Several major entertainment publications had announced new editorial policies designed to ensure that allegations of abuse would be taken more seriously and investigated more thoroughly. The industry had also begun to examine its own practices and to consider how it could better protect vulnerable individuals from predatory behavior. The federal investigation that had brought down Sean's empire had also had broader implications for law enforcement. The case had demonstrated the importance of federal resources in investigating complex criminal enterprises, and it had highlighted the need for specialized training and expertise in handling cases involving wealthy and influential defendants. The FBI had established a new unit dedicated to investigating crimes involving entertainment industry figures, recognizing that the industry's unique characteristics required specialized knowledge and expertise. The unit had already begun investigating several other cases involving allegations of abuse and exploitation by powerful figures in the entertainment industry. The case had also had international implications, as Sean's criminal activities had extended beyond the United States. Law enforcement agencies in several countries had begun their own investigations into his activities, and some had initiated proceedings to seize assets that had been connected to his criminal enterprise. The psychological impact of Sean's conviction on other powerful figures in the entertainment industry was significant and ongoing. Many had been forced to confront their own behavior and to consider whether they had crossed ethical or legal lines in their pursuit of success and power. The case had served as a wake-up call for an industry that had long tolerated abusive behavior in exchange for commercial success. The conviction had also had broader implications for American society and culture. The case had highlighted the ways in which wealth and power could be used to conceal and facilitate criminal behavior, and it had demonstrated the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions, regardless of their status or influence. The victims of Sean's crimes had shown extraordinary courage in coming forward and had played a crucial role in bringing him to justice. Their willingness to speak out had not only resulted in his conviction, but had also encouraged other victims of powerful predators to come forward. The impact of their courage would continue to be felt for years to come. The case had also highlighted the importance of believing and supporting victims of abuse, particularly when they were challenging powerful and influential figures. The victims in Sean's case had faced significant obstacles in being believed and taken seriously, but their persistence and courage had ultimately prevailed. As Sean Combs continued to serve his sentence, the full impact of his crimes and conviction continued to unfold. The man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in American entertainment had become a symbol of the abuse of power and the importance of accountability. His fall from grace had been complete and irreversible, but it had also served as a catalyst for important changes in the entertainment industry and in American society as a whole. The story of Sean Combs was ultimately a story about the corruption of power and the importance of justice. It was a reminder that no one, regardless of their wealth or influence, was above the law, and that the courage of victims and the determination of law enforcement could ultimately prevail over even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The legacy of Sean Combs would be forever tainted by his crimes, but his conviction would also serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability and the possibility of justice. The victims who had suffered under his abuse had shown that it was possible to challenge even the most powerful figures and to hold them accountable for their actions. The case had changed the entertainment industry forever, and it had sent a clear message that abusive behavior would no longer be tolerated or ignored. The man who had once seemed untouchable had been brought to justice, and his conviction would serve as a warning to others who might consider similar behavior. In the end, the story of Sean Combs was a story about the triumph of justice over power and the importance of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a reminder that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could be brought down by the determination of victims and the commitment of law enforcement to holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions. The 573 days that had passed between Cassie Ventura's lawsuit and Sean's conviction had fundamentally altered the landscape of American entertainment and had established important precedents for how cases involving wealthy and influential defendants would be prosecuted in the future. The empire that had taken decades to build had been destroyed in less than 2 years, but the impact of its collapse would be felt for generations to come.